and use the hashtag Assembly Budget for this meeting. Item 2 is declarations of interest. The committee is recommended to note the list of offices held by Assembly members. Members, do you have any other disclosable interests you want to make at this time? Okay, thank you, members. Item 3 then, the main item of business for this morning is the draft GLA budget for 2018-19. We have two sessions today, the first of which we have members from, representatives from the OPDC. So I'd like to welcome them in order. Doug Wilson, the Chief Operating Officer, Victoria Hills, the Chief Executive, and David Galley, the Assistant Director of Finance at the GLA, who seems to be turning up to all of these meetings. So commiserations to you and welcome to you two. The opening question, as always, falls to me, and it's to you, Victoria. The Mayor's cut your budget by 10% from 17-18. Does this provide you with enough to achieve your objectives for the year ahead?
Well, thank you, Chair, and firstly I'd like to wish you and to the rest of the committee Happy New Year, and thank you for having us back again. And if I may, I would just like to take a moment to update you on what we have achieved over the last 12 months, and with strong progress being made, particularly in putting in a strong planning framework into place. We have the local plan through a second stage consultation. We have our master planning team appointed and making excellent progress. We have a business plan going to our board for approval this month, which is a really helpful step forward. We've spent a lot of time putting together a very strong bid for housing infrastructure funding to the CLG, and we look forward to some early news on our expression of interest. Hopefully in the next few weeks would be very nice. And we've been making strong progress on planning applications and actually delivery. So although we widely quote that we've got 11,000 homes in the planning system, which is correct, we have now consented OPDC over 2,000 of those, and putting that into perspective with those delegated to Ealing at North Acton, we've got 4,800 homes on their way. We did actually start groundbreaking in September this year for the first 608, I think it is, and we have just signed our second major Section 106 for Fairview Homes for another 800 up at First Central. So delivery is starting to happen, and which is great news, and we are expecting Car Giant's planning application for their major site this year. We have been taking on board the recommendations from the strategic review. We've had a rejig of the board, and we look forward to being able to make some announcements on some new board members, particularly with an investment committee focus in the very near future. We've been doing a lot of work on Park Royal and on Great Places. As you will recall, we secured 1.5 million for some early interventions there, which has been very helpful, and we hope to formally launch that shortly. On infrastructure, we've been doing an awful lot of work on establishing exactly what's required to get the greater number of homes away, and we're moving ever closer to having a very finalised master plan, setting that all out very clearly. We designated our second neighbourhood forum over the course of last year, which is quite an important step because that provides a really useful forum for us to communicate and involve the local community in the planning of future neighbourhood and neighbourhoods. We've obviously done extensive communications and been raising the profile of the project, working very closely, not just at a London level, but with our regional and national partners and growth areas up along phase 2 and phase 1 of the line. And we've made substantial progress with HS2. We've been influencing the design of the station, and that takes a lot of time, as you can imagine. HS2 is a big organisation and likes to do things in a very set, structured way, but we've spent time with them to think about how they might build that station for maximum opportunity in the long run. So putting all of that together, I think Old Oak is increasingly looking at as a magnet for future development. We can see that because some is away, but it's also a magnet for future rail lines. We already knew that 10 rail lines were coming in and out of Old Oak, but the one thing that has changed since I last sat in front of this committee is there are a number of schemes that are coming forward that weren't on the books before but now look like they are, one being the Dudding Hill line, which is now included in the Mayor's Transport Strategy. Another being the Chiltern line, which the DfT are very seriously considering bringing into Old Oak. And only 2 weeks ago, I was meeting with the Heathrow Southern Rail people, who are also looking to bring that line into Old Oak. So that takes 10 to 13, which means that we're now looking at what I think will be the most accessible part of the UK's rail network, with those 13 national and potentially international connections coming in. So our focus has obviously been on how we can get early delivery away. That business plan I've talked about is all about Old Oak North, the first 10 to 15,000 homes, broadly comparable to the size of Barking Riverside. And that will keep us busy for about 20 years. But that's obviously just phase one. But our HIF in particular and our master planning has been very much focused on that. And that's been very much the driving strategy. So as we move rapidly towards celebrating our 3rd birthday, I'm very proud that we've set out the very strong framework for this long-term project going forward. So to answer your very specific question, Chair, in terms of our resourcing, we've had very extensive conversations with the GLA on this, and I'm very confident that what we have in our budget today is sufficient for what we need to do today. We do have agreement, our chairman has that agreement with the mayor personally, that when we need more, if there's urgent work that needs to come forward or something's coming forward a bit earlier, an example would be the Housing Infrastructure Fund. If we're able to secure some infrastructure funding on that, and we have put in for the full amount, that's no secret, we've asked for £250 million, that's clearly going to require a not insignificant delivery team to get that infrastructure away. If we find ourselves in that situation, which I sincerely hope we do, then we'll be having a further conversation with the GLA about how we can resource up the organisation to deliver that. So I have every confidence we need to do what we need to do now, and we have the commitment that if we need more, then we have that open, early and transparent conversation with the GLA to support us on that.
Okay, can I thank you for that? That was a very comprehensive introduction. A lot of what you've covered in that we will go into a bit more detail as the meeting goes along. The first and most obvious question, I suppose, is that your budget is being kept flat for the next 4 years, but you've opened the door there a little bit to what we're going to probe around that, which is that if you have conversations with the Mayor's office, if it turns out that more resourcing is needed, you've been given indications that you would receive more. Have numbers been attached to those indications?
Well, I mean, it's a bit like asking how big is a piece of string. If I take, for example, the HIF example, we may be successful in securing £250 million. We may be successful in securing £50 million. If it's £50 million, we're talking about some early detailed design work, and the sort of extra resources we might need to help us would be significantly less than if we're looking for a full-blown business case for the significant infrastructure which we think is required to get that early part of Old Oak North away. So I'm very hesitant at attaching figures and saying, you know, we need X million more in this scenario at this moment in time. Clearly we're doing a lot of detailed work behind the scenes in anticipation of what those scenarios may look like. But until we have some feedback from our external partners, the HCA and CLG on that, it's going to be very difficult. The most important thing for myself and the chairman, who incidentally I should have offered her apologies, is sincerely apologises that she can't be here today. But the most important thing for her is that she's had that very helpful conversation with the GLA and the Mayor personally, that if we need extra support, then we come and discuss what that support looks like.
Okay. Now, last year, the Mayor cut your budget and took the slightly unusual step of basing that cut around your outturn rather than the previous year's budget, which is, well, groundbreaking, shall we say, in public sector finance terms. And there was a lot of toing and froing around this, and additional money was granted to the OPDC through the contingency fund. Now, you've actually underspent your budget this year. Why is that?
There's one primary reason for that, and that is that part of the Great Place Scheme funding requires us to raise an element of sponsorship to contribute towards that. We've taken the view that as long as that sponsorship's not confirmed, that we need to be able to underwrite any shortfall in sponsorship. So we cut back on our expenditure to the tune of $300,000 with the intention of requesting that be carried forward should it be required to underwrite any shortfall in sponsorship. So the actual unintentional underspend, if you like, is less than $100,000.
Okay. Now, in the draft budget, the Great Place scheme, our understanding is that you were awarded £1.5 million. Is that right?
Yeah.
And reflected in the draft budget, it appears to be a budget line of £800,000 per year for the next 4 years, which of course is £3.2 million. How does that stack up?
It shouldn't be. We should only be spending the 1.5 plus the additional elements. I need to look at those figures and come back to you on that. But certainly we don't have that much Great Place
Okay.
scheme funding coming in.
We will write to you after the meeting anyway, and I think we'll clear that up in writing afterwards. I'm going to move on to Assemblymember Cooper.
I actually just wanted to see if we could get, I know that we're going to ask about contingency, but I just wanted to get a comment from David Galley on what Victoria was just saying. I mean, I can understand why, Victoria, you're not wanting to be pinned down when you don't know whether the HIF bid is going to come through and so on and so forth, but I just want to check that there is sufficient in contingency to cover any level of successful bid, with the support to ensure that the staff are there to make that bid fly.
The balance of the contingency we have is 1.2 million. So the balance of the contingency is 1.2 million. That will provide some resource, one imagines, in 18-19. Whether it actually is sufficient over the whole period, we need to review, as Victoria says. Clearly, the scale of regeneration development that is envisaged, 1.2 million isn't going to get too far. So we'll need to revisit the numbers OPDC need once we have the HIF bid, once we have their business plan.
But there's an initial amount there. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I'll follow that up, David. I mean, how flexible is the GLA around this? I mean, we've just heard from Victoria that the Chair has sat down with the Mayor face to face, and the Mayor has offered assurances that money will be available in the event of certain things happening. By the same token, we hear constantly from the Mayor and his team how tight finances are and how there's no money for this, that or the other. I mean, how much money are we talking about that could be suddenly made available in year to the OPDC if required?
Can I just clarify? I wasn't saying there was a blank check. What I was saying, the commitment was there to have a discussion about what was required. So it wasn't sort of whatever you need, I can give it. It was, let's have the conversation about what you require. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure how reassured I feel by that statement, because anyone can have a conversation about, well, we need this much money. Well, that's great. We haven't got any. Then what happens?
I mean, within the overall Mayor's budget, I mean, there's obviously levels of flexibility that are set out. So, for instance, there's a collection fund surplus of 20 million, which at present is unallocated. We obviously need to await the borough returns at the end.
Sorry, could you say that again? A surplus of what?
So there's a collection fund surplus we're estimating of £20 million, which is set out in the budget, which is not yet allocated. We need to await the borough returns on business rates and council tax surpluses at the end of January, and so the Mayor's final budget in February will set out our revised estimates of the level of flexibility we may have. So far, we've obviously made very prudent assumptions about business rates and collection fund surpluses, but we need to review those when we have the final budget numbers. So that would give some reassurance that there will be additional resources we need to consider. And obviously, OPDC would be one of the many competing bids for that scarce resource.
Yes, but we have been hearing from the Mayor incessantly for over a year that we have a drastically underfunded police service. He's roped the fire brigade into that as well. He's putting up council tax by the largest amount in more than a decade, and he's claiming that still isn't enough to plug the gap. If all of that is true, then how much flexibility do we really have here?
Well, as I say, I mean, there are obviously some difficult choices for the Mayor to make around the scarce level of additional resources that we may have available. That will emerge in early February with the final budget, but clearly there's a trade-off to be made between, the need for OPDC to have resources Victoria has described, as against, as you say, the demands upon police and fire and elsewhere across the group.
Okay. Right, we're going to move on and talk about the Housing Infrastructure Fund bid, because this is quite interesting and potentially very exciting. And you addressed it in your opening remarks. So Assemblymember Pigeon is the lead for us on that.
Yes, so you've already started touching on this, Victoria. Do you want to explain a bit more what you've actually asked government for in your initial bid for Housing Infrastructure Fund money?
Sure. I will set out the kind of overarching piece that I can Doug may want to come back on a bit of the detail. But you appreciate some of it is a bit commercially sensitive because of what I'm about to say. So it is a bit of what it says on the tin. It is infrastructure for housing. It's not infrastructure for housing wouldn't necessarily be delivered. It's about accelerating the housing delivery. So it's the old challenge that all major development sites have, particularly brownfield, is sort of who's going to blink first. We all know that there's some value later on. We know we're going to get some money out on Section 106 to pay for an energy centre or a primary school or a bridge or a road or traffic lights, whatever it is. But we haven't got the money up front. So how do we finance? How do we cash flow that? And that's the principle of this. So we've looked at, through the master planning work that we've done, very specifically on a swathe of land to the north of Old Oak, a continuation of that groundbreaking site that I talked about earlier. And if you were going to continue that swathe, what's the bare minimum that you require to get development going there to make it more viable, or indeed viable in the first place, because a lot of that land is very tricky. So the sorts of things that are included in that bid range from physical pieces of kit, so there is a bridge in there, there is an energy centre in there, to some more technical, detailed design works for further pieces of infrastructure that will come a bit later on, whether they be sort of punching underneath viaducts or going over things. And you know, that's, I think that's broadly about it. Doug may come in. It's you know, £250 million sounds an awful lot of money, and it is. But when you're talking about putting bridges over canals and opening up viaducts and putting in energy centres, there is also the commercially sensitive bit in that, is that there is obviously some money in there for land acquisitions, which you have to have for certainty of delivery. If you're going to land a bridge somewhere, you need to know that you can do it. And our starting point is we always want to negotiate and have cooperation with landowners. But if we're unable to do that, we need to be able to buy the land to put those bits of kit onto. So it all comes back to accelerating that housing delivery, bringing on a development partner. We're only going to be able to do that for some of those sites in entirety or in piecemeal, if we can have some infrastructure funding up front, which acts as a very tasty carrot, if you like, to bring people on board. We were incredibly lucky with our first site. It's not just luck, it's a lot of hard work, that the first major scheme didn't require an awful lot of infrastructure to get it away. But the easy ones are the first ones, the later ones more complicated, and they require some upfront infrastructure, which is not unusual for brownfield sites. We see that across London and beyond.
We saw that with the Olympic Park and the amount of cleaning of that site before it could be developed for the Olympics and beyond. I understand you expect to hear early in 2018 whether you're through to the next stage of the process. Could you sort of outline for us a timetable and the next steps for the bid, please?
I can outline what we understand to be the timetable, but I would just preface this by saying this time last year, it's fair to say nobody had actually heard of the HIF. This is an entirely new process, an entirely new fund, and therefore there is a certain amount of CLG bedding the process down with HCA. So, you know, what I'm about to say is our understanding, but if HCA were here, which I kind of wish they were, they may be able to give us an even more current update. We understand that the bit of the process we've gone through at the moment is the expression of interest, which is a very high level. This is what we'd like to put in, and this is how much it would cost. If there's a thinning out now, you won't be surprised to hear that nationally it was significantly oversubscribed, and they've got to do a very long list to a long list to a short list. We would like to get to the short list stage, and that we understand sometime in January, but sometimes the civil servants also use the expression spring.
Yes.
But conscious of the pre-election period rapidly approaching, we would imagine it's going to be back end of January, early February latest. That announcement of the sites that have been selected to go through to the next stage. And the next stage, as we understand it, is working up a detailed Treasury proof business case for those infrastructure pieces. It's very much akin to what we're aware our counterparts down at Ebbsfleet have been doing, making a case for, let's say, an energy centre. What's the economic case? What's the wider economic benefits, etc., and then drawing down against that. So we would, the timing for that, as we understand it, is all of that detailed business case work would be required to have been undertaken by the summer, with some sort of announcement due around September time as to who has been successful. Now, I'll preface that again by saying that was our understanding before the Christmas break. Things may have evolved further, and we haven't yet caught up with the HCA or CLG since the Christmas break.
No, of course, I understand, and government can change its mind at any moment. So that's very helpful. But if you find out, say, February, that you have been shortlisted, you've then got to work up this very technical Treasury levels or business case you outlined. Do you need the Mayor to commit some further resources or funding at that point in order that you're able to put in a hopefully successful bid?
Yes, I think the balance of the contingency that David alluded to, which is sitting there, that's the point where we'll be having a very detailed conversation with the GLA to say, to get this piece of work done, this is exactly what we think we need to do, and this is how much it's going to cost, and we'll make the case then, as we did when we drew down on contingency beforehand, most likely through a mayoral decision form, to secure that additional funding, and that would happen very rapidly. So that we could get on and do the work.
And what about wider resources across the GLA group? Because obviously Doug has another role, don't you? Well, you certainly did before. You worked in finance.
Not anymore.
No longer.
No longer. It's your full-time OPDC. But, you know, there's the housing and land teams and other. Is there a resource there you could, you know, as it were, borrow for a month to help work this up rather than committing to...
Sure. So on that wider resource issue, I'm sure we may come back to on shared services. We've obviously sought to share as many services as possible to be as lean as organisation as we can be. And the arrangement that we have in place with Housing and Land is an informal arrangement, but we do have one of their officers in our team for a number of hours every week helping us on those early delivery sites. As we move forward to greater clarity on the HIF, I would be looking forward to sitting down with the Executive Director of Housing and Land again to say what more resource could we have to help us do this work. I appreciate they're also incredibly busy, although they have, I understand, just brought on some additional resource. So we would be looking to secure as much of that as we could within house. There is an inevitability, though, that some of the expertise that will be required to put forward that Treasury-approved business case will require some management expertise that we don't have in-house. So we will have to buy in bits and pieces for it. But I would very much like to have as much help, not just within Housing and Land, any resource that we could have from TfL's commercial development team as well. I speak regularly with the director there. They're obviously living and breathing this stuff daily, but also under incredible pressure to move quickly. And likewise, over at the Legacy Corporation, I speak with the Executive Director of Commercial Development there as well. She's also under a lot of pressure to move things forward, but if they're able to help them, we would like to use some of their resource. I'll just bring in Doug at this moment to add a couple of points.
Just to add to that, we do have a very good relationship with the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and they're already providing us with some support in relation to our infrastructure work, and have confirmed they'll provide further support should our bid get through to the next stage.
Okay. So you've got, but if your bid then is successful next autumn, and say you've got everything you wanted, this is a huge thing. That's going to change the nature of your organisation. You said it's very lean at the moment, very trim. Are you then going to have to, you know, really recruit a lot more staff in order to deliver?
I mean, what I can say at this moment in time, and things do change, is the model that I envisage that we would have would be not dissimilar to the model the ODA used, for example, where you bring in a delivery partner for certain aspects. So they're not a core part of your team. They're not direct employees of OPDC, but you would bring them in for a fixed period to deliver infrastructure. I'm not going to name any of the companies to give them an advert here, but there are many organisations that specialise in sort of coming in, doing something, delivering it, and then leaving again. So I wouldn't envisage the core size of the team to change very much. Clearly, we might want to bring on a bit more commercial expertise, either directly or indirectly through some of those shared resources we were just discussing. But in terms of the crunching the day-to-day programme delivery of, what it takes to deliver a bridge, let's just say, across the canal, I would imagine we would have a delivery partner sitting in, being cliented by us to actually do that detailed delivery. But, as I say, things could change over the course of the next year, but that's the model that I envisage at this current time.
And you've got currently the expertise in-house, or you would get the expertise in order to be able to manage those relationships, because we've seen issues at LLDC in terms of not having really the expertise in terms of some of these specialist areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge for the public sector to have, the very best of the expertise in the industry. But one of the brilliant things about a project like Old Oak and Park Royal is they don't come along very often. So we have been able to attract some excellent expertise back in from the private sector, from people who genuinely want to come in and work on this project. So we're very lucky that we're short to bring in a new director of commercial who's coming in from the private sector. We haven't announced it yet, so I can't tell you where from, but he's from a very reputable developer involved in a major scheme in London currently. And we will be bringing in, at the moment we have a temporary resource leading our master planning, but as that moves forward to a delivery development role, we will bring somebody in at the right level to support on that. We obviously have an excellent director of planning already, and I've got an excellent chief operating officer and chief finance officer sat next to me here. Do we need any more than that? I'm not complacent. We'll keep it under regular review, and I will do that in regular dialogue with the chairman. It's certainly at the top of her mind is, do we have the right resource? But I don't underestimate the challenge. It's there for a lot of these major public sector-led projects. But I'm hopeful that the lure of the Old Oak project is one that we are able to attract the calibre of candidates to help us to do what we need to do.
Okay, so this is all very exciting, your infrastructure fund bid, all this, and if it goes well, what's plan B? You don't secure any money at all. How are you going to achieve your housing targets and jobs?
Well, plan B, if I sort of cast back to the figures I was quoting earlier, is actually we're not at base camp. We've actually moved on from that anyway. So the great news is that partly through the profile of the project being associated with HS2, but partly because of its geographical location, it's West London, but the proximity to Heathrow and the rest of the country, which is quite important because we're very much part of that gateway to the Midlands Engine and Northern Powerhouse, is Old Oak is seen as a bit of a launch pad for those investors and developers. If they want to come into the UK and they want to do interesting things, it's a good place to come. So we have numbers moving away quite nicely. As I say, we've had the first major scheme, QPR Genesis JV, on the way, and that's being built. Fairview want to move very quickly. These aren't small numbers that are coming through. We've granted a number of consents down Scrubs Lane. And the kind of earlier sites will come through. So if we sat back and did nothing with HIF, I'm confident in 5 years' time we'd be up at about the 5,000 home mark, which, is not insignificant. It's a great start. And so what would happen without the HIF is you wouldn't have the acceleration of the more tricky site. They would come eventually, because I do believe the HS2 factor is such a magnet. They take control of the site this year. The clock's starting to tick on it opening. Okay, it's 8 years away, but we're all familiar with the Crossrail project, just how quickly that comes round. And I think it's worth remembering, as I just said, nobody had heard of HIF this time last year. One thing we do know that there is a direct need for housing delivery. The government make that very clear. The Mayor makes it very clear. So everybody wants housing delivery. So if it's not going to be HIF, then it might be something else. Who knows where we'll be in 6 months' time? Something else may come out the mix. So I don't want to sound complacent, but whatever the opportunity is for funding, we will go for it. I think it would be unlikely that there won't be other opportunities for funding for infrastructure for housing coming up. If we don't get HIF this time, it may be that it wasn't our time for that particular fund. Will there be something else that comes up in 6 to 12 months' time? I think highly likely. Will we continue delivering the earlier schemes? Yes, we will. Will the north part of the site go a bit slower? Quite possibly without HIF. But it doesn't mean that nothing's going to happen. We do look forward for acceleration. That's very much what my chairman and the mayor wants to see, is accelerated delivery. That's what HCA want to see as well. So we're working really closely on that relationship with the HCA to make that case. If the case isn't successful this time round, we will be very actively exploring what the other opportunities are.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Senior Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a little bit about, I know you said it was commercially sensitive, but some of the aspects of infrastructure on this site are quite complex because of the nature of the precursor uses. And so what I wanted to know particularly about was how you're building in sustainability into the infrastructure and what you're looking at there, and in particular, what kind of liaison you've had, for example, with, you talked about an energy centre. Are you in discussion, I presume, with UK Power Networks about the need for the different kind of power that the site will require, and also with Thames Water, because obviously changing the site over to extensive use for domestic dwellings is a huge change. So both in terms of water supply and drainage, and are you looking at sustainable drainage and all of those aspects? So if you could give us some sort of without delving into too much of the commercially sensitive aspects, some kind of idea about how you're building in sustainability with reference particularly to those aspects around energy and water.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. It's often sort of overlooked in the context of all of the other important discussions we're having, and yet it's perhaps one of the most important aspects, because if we can't build a new community in a sustainable way, people might not want to live there, but they might not be able to live there if it's flooded or etc. So it's a very helpful question. The detail of a lot of that is, of course, included in the supplementary documents to our local plan. We've done an extensive amount of strategy work on it. But just to pick up your particular points, the infrastructure funding and having upfront infrastructure funding enables you to do things in a more sustainable way. And the reason for that is you can join things up in a way that if it's left piecemeal to developers, as you know, they will just do what they want to do because that suits their development, whether that be how they want to deal with drainage, how they want to deal with heating and energy networks, and how they want to deal with waste. So the real size of the prize there is having a coordinated approach to these things, and we'd very much like to do that, learning from lessons from the Olympics. Indeed, our lead sustainability officer joined us from the ODA. He worked on the Olympic Park, so we've got the lessons. We know what we'd like to do. And actually, things have moved on, of course, since 2012, and there are now even better ways of doing things. So we're not working in a sort of vacuum of what OPDC would like to do. We're absolutely doing this hand in hand with the GLA's environment team, because our starting point is we want to be not just in accordance with GLA, London Plan and the environment strategy. We want to be actually providing the opportunity for the Deputy Mayor for Environment and our team to showcase a few of the things that they would like to do, because there aren't too many opportunities to do something from scratch. So how do we go about doing that? Well, very, very intensive conversations with the GLA counterparts to ensure that we're absolutely aligned and doing what we should do. There are obviously challenging issues within that on energy and heat in particular, and lots of trade-off type discussions that are currently going on and very live. But involving those third-party delivery partners early on is really key, and we are absolutely doing that. I'm not allowed to talk about commercially sensitive things, but I can take the opportunity to put the pressure on with Thames Water, because we've had some very productive early conversations with Thames Water about how we might take some energy out of the water system. And they're doing some really interesting things up in Scotland at the moment and using heat from sewers. It's not been done in England yet, and they've committed to look to us about how we could do that at Old Oak, which is really exciting. So those early conversations for them about how they might do something exciting, and for us about how we can meet the wider sustainability aspirations are absolutely going on. National Grid is part of it, and there's some very practical issues like HS2 need to ramp up their power massively because Old Oak is on the critical path for the tunnel boring machines. 2 go east and 2 go west. All the tunnelling comes in and out of Old Oak, and that starts with vengeance sort of 18, 19 and on. And they're going to need to ramp up the power provision. So we're having some very detailed conversations with HS2 to say, don't just patch it. Let's have a way of making this sustainable so that we can use that extra resource that you've created to support the community going forward. So, I mean, there's just a flavour of some of the conversations that we're having. Sustainable transport is absolutely at the heart of what we're trying to do. We've had extensive conversations with Val and the team on healthy high streets. It's going to be a zero or low car development. It has to be because there's no capacity to put in any new roads, and furthermore, if you think about those 13 rail lines that I mentioned earlier, this probably will have the highest PTAL rating of any location in the UK. So why you would need to have a car to get in and out of it is slightly beyond me. And I do think by the time that the big part of the development starts to get going in the late 20s, early 30s, we would have moved away from the current sort of car ownership model that we've got going on now. A lot of the millennials and younger people I speak to aren't used to owning things. They don't own any music, they stream it. They certainly won't think about owning a car. They can just hire it if they need it. So we'll move away from that sort of predict and provide, and we'll move to a new streetscape. That's my vision for the area. So
that's all really encouraging, and you've covered a number of the other points that I didn't dare bring in, so I wasn't sure if we had enough time. But there was something that you just touched on, which is my sort of subsequent follow-on question, which is the concern that if you don't get the money through the infrastructure fund, that it might be a more piecemeal approach. You were talking in answer to Caroline's question about it being a slower approach and perhaps 5,000 homes over 5 years. How obviously having the more holistic approach across the whole of the site can drive some of the benefits that you were just describing, and actually it then becomes a real showcase for what London can achieve. But would we still be in a position to do that if it's a more piecemeal situation, and is that a worry for you?
Well, of course, it is a worry, but how do we mitigate against that? And we have certain powers through, as we are the local planning authority, so we can require conditions that are reasonable, and we can use all of our powers of persuasion. I mean, these are not poverty-stricken developers who are knocking on our doors asking for our help.
I don't think I've met one of those. Do they exist somewhere else?
Well, if you do, I mean, they're a rare breed. These are people who have turned up early because they see an opportunity. And our starting point is we want to work with people who are going to help us to achieve the great place here, and part of that has to be sustainability. So, I'm not going to give any names away here of some of the people that we're discussing with, but their starting point is they want to put in a heating system that suits their development, and our starting point is that's not good enough. So how do we require them to do something different? Well, our big tool our ACE card is the planning controls that we have. If we didn't have those, we'd just be looking for persuasion, and that only goes so far.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Prince.
Victoria, I was intrigued by your comments in relation to car ownership, and sort of rang a bell of what was being said back in the 50s when they built the Dagenham Council Estate, which was at the time the largest council estate in Europe. And they said, oh, well, of course we're making no provision for cars because people who own these houses will never, ever own a car.
What's the question? I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk about that because, as you know, transport is a big passion of mine. I mean, could I start by saying, that the 50s context is a very different context to where the context we're moving into. I'm not going to claim to be the world's sort of leading expert on car trends, but what I will say is my earlier statement, I hope you didn't take it flippantly, the working generation that's coming through at the moment, the tail off in car ownership in London, I do think as we move towards a more digital economy, you know, the young people I talk to, and when I say young, I'm not talking teenagers, I'm talking sort of early 20s, you know, given the choice to being able to own part of a car or have a car when they might need it, compared to having to own a car outright and tax it, insure it, MOT it, fill it up with fuel, whatever you've got to do, in a very time sort of poor economy that you know many people live in. I'm just saying I think that will become less attractive going forward. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I would invite you to join me on a ride around an autonomous vehicle in Greenwich and have a look into what I think will be the future, which is, you know, people who will need to use cars and can use them will still be able to, of course. We're not saying there's a car ban, but what we are saying is it's a recognition that the model of car ownership in society is likely to change. And I think it's already bearing its way out in terms of licences being issued. It's bearing its way out in terms of car sales. I think the car still has an important role to play in society. I'm certainly not saying it doesn't. What I am saying is the way that we own it and use it going forward will be different. I could be completely wrong on this, but that's just my own personal view.
I mean, I share some of your thoughts, and Caroline quite rightly quipped. We did go to Greenwich to have a ride in a driverless car, but we weren't allowed in.
Well, I will fix that for you. If you would like to come around on the driverless car, Keith,
I
will fix that for
really,
you.
You know, I've driven in a very similar pod in Heathrow. So
this one's slightly different because it's not going to and from a place.
No,
it's going around a community.
My only question really is, you know, what if you're wrong, and also what provision are you making for car clubs and TAL?
Well, I mean, the car club one's an easy one. We've got provision in the local plan that the parking standards are very much following TfL's parking standards. So the provision is there. And, you know, what if we are wrong? Well, the way that we've worded our highway requirements is very flexibly. So we don't use the word driverless vehicles or autonomous vehicles anywhere because, you know, we're writing a policy document now in 8 years' time or 10 years' time. It might be called something else or something else has come along. Who knows? What we do know, though, is that the local roads will not take a model where everybody can own and park a car there. And what we do know is that this is going to be the most sustainable, connected public transport part of the UK's rail network. I challenge anyone to find somewhere more. Nobody ever corrects me on it, so it must be right, when the station opens in 2026. So we could be wrong, but I'm about planning for the future and thinking about future proofing. And for me, future proofing is it has to take on board a change in travel behaviour, and, you know, only too often we can see where people aren't planning for the future, there are unintended consequences of that.
That's a fair comment, just that the designers in the 50s were wrong. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to the next section, which is about land deals, particularly the Memorandum of Understanding, which was provoked a certain amount of discussion last year. And Assembly Member Berry is going to lead on this for us.
Thank you very much. We've discussed this previously at the plenary meeting. Although you're like a facilitating organisation, you have got the need to buy some land from HS2 and from Network Rail. There's the Memorandum of Understanding with the DfT. We've asked previously if it can be renegotiated. The Mayor's Review recommended this, but the new chair was reluctant to do so. So can you give us an update on this, and have you made any progress on that land deal since we last spoke?
You're happy for me to go first, yeah? Do you want to go?
No, I'll go. I don't think the chair was reluctant to renegotiate it, but she had her own views on the validity of the deal, and we did work quite hard at achieving a situation where we did get agreement to get land at existing use value, which we believe is quite an important concession, and the chair agreed with that. So things have moved on since then. The chair has written to the Secretary of State and had a response from him, which is, in our view, quite favourable. and we're about to take forward negotiations on the MOU. The broad intention of that is not to seek to unpick the existing use value, but rather to put some bones on that. We're instructing joint valuation with Network Rail on some of the key sites so that we can agree what these existing use values are. And importantly, we've also got agreement in principle that whereas the MOU looks at us fulfilling 4 conditions precedent before we can then acquire any land, to actually talking about individual land parcels immediately, because there are some, particularly in the context of our Housing Infrastructure Fund bid, which is key that we move on quickly. And again, we're on the point of taking forward discussions with Network Rail on some of those key sites. So quite a lot is happening.
Thank you very much. A few things that come out of that. The key sites you mentioned, when you were talking about the Housing Infrastructure Fund bid, those were mainly bits of land to facilitate the infrastructure. They weren't land for housing or anything like that. Is that what you're talking about, the bringing forwards immediately?
It will be a combination. The initial infrastructure we're talking about is designed to open up Old Oak North to bring forward the development. So it's, in broad terms, a road cutting through the site. It will require, as Victoria said, 2 bridges and an underpass, and it will require land, but in acquiring some of that land, particularly the Network Rail land, it will only require a part of that, and we'll be able to develop around the road, which delivers both benefits. And has a further benefit in terms of funding, in that any development we do can then deliver a return which can be recycled into funding further infrastructure.
So those are likely to be quite relatively small sites, in fact, the leftover bits after you've built the infrastructure, there'll be potentially things to do, go into the small sites programme?
Not necessarily, and again it goes back to Victoria's comment about working with landowners, because some of the sites are larger than are required for the road, significantly larger. And if the landowner is prepared to work with us in bringing these forward, that will again bring forward development far quicker than if we're simply acquiring the land needed for the road and driving a swathe through their land.
That makes sense too. Are you working with the GLA Housing and Land team on all of this? Because obviously there's the slightly mysterious so far, because there's no budget for it in the plan so far, the £250 million land fund that the Mayor is putting together. Is that something, I mean, obviously we all have our eye on that for various things, but is that something you're talking to the Mayor about, and is part of the reason why we don't have details of it yet in the budget, because it's in some way tied up with your bid or anything like that?
I think in 2 parts. Yes, we're working with Housing and Land. In fact, we've got support of one of their officers on the key sites that we're talking about to help us in our discussions with Network Rail. In terms of the 250 million, yes, we, like many others, have our eyes on it. We also think that we can offer a better deal than most others, going back to the existing use value clause in the MOU. And we know that our colleagues are looking at some of the sites in our area as well.
Okay, that's really useful
that
to know.
decision rests with them ultimately.
Yes, and we'll be pressing the Mayor on some of that later in the next meeting that we have. Do you know yet how much you might need to spend? Have you got a budget yet for how much land is going to cost you? You seem to be making
how much we need to spend on land?
Yeah.
We have made an estimate for again, going back to this road that we need to drive through, an estimate for acquiring the land that we need for that, plus a stretch on either side for development. Now, that involves a number of landowners, and I can't really go into any more detail than that, but that's included in our Housing Infrastructure Fund bid.
Okay, and will we see, if you're successful, will we see the bid? I mean, will the DCLG publish the bids when they shortlist?
At some point there will be details, but at the moment it's confidential for obvious reasons.
Do you know the answer to that, if they'll publish once they've shortlisted?
Yeah, I would imagine they'll want to do a nice announcement associated with this, and the business case stage. That I can see no reason why they won't be publicly available, certainly at a high level. But at the moment, we're not in a position to share the details of those because it's such an early stage.
I can't imagine from their point of view or ours would want them to go into a level of detail, because assuming we're successful in that bid, we will then commence negotiations with landowners, and we wouldn't want to be disadvantaged in those negotiations.
That's a good point, thank you. When will we see more details then about your plans for land purchase and how much it's going to cost? I mean, when will that start to come out?
In terms of process, we have now produced our business plan for Old Oak North. We're consulting with the Mayor on that, and our intention is to take that to our board for approval at the end of this month. Once it's been approved by the board, we'll look at what we can publish in redacted form to provide as much information publicly as we can.
Okay, thank you very much. Is anyone else?
Yeah, just one follow-up tie-up question from me, which is you mentioned the exchange of letters between the Chair and the Secretary of State. Is that something you would be able to provide to us?
I imagine we can. We can certainly check the status of those.
We will check the status of those, and if we're able to share those with you, we'll be delighted to do so.
Okay. In the usual way, we'll write to you after the meeting, and we'll include that as a request in the meeting. We're going to move on and talk about the final part, actually, the local plan, and Assemblymember Desai is going to take on that.
Thank you, Chair. If I could ask you, Ms. Hills, you talked about the local plan earlier, or you mentioned it in answer to an earlier question. Can you update us as to where you're with the plan in terms of finalising and adopting it, and particularly any risk that which would cause a delay? And if so, what impact would this have?
So, as I noted earlier, we're at the Reg 19 stage now, which is the second stage consultation. So it's the final piece, if you like. We've had the public consultation, and the team are now working through in detail all of those comments. To answer your question about risk, if there are any changes that we want to make to the version that we consulted on that are viewed to be so significant that they require a reconsultation, then the risk there is that we have to run another reconsultation, and that adds a bit of delay to the programme. Before I say a bit more about that, just to explain that in a bit more detail and what those changes may be. As a new organisation, we're not yet three, we effectively started from scratch with a local plan. Whilst there were bits and pieces from the three boroughs that we covered, nobody had gone into the level of detail required for a detailed local plan to bring forward this opportunity area. And so an awful lot of work was done on the Reg 18 and Reg 19. We've now got a situation where the master plan team has sort of caught up with that, and they've looked in great detail about the proposals and policies that we have in there. It's more the proposals, actually. And it's fair to say that there's a very sort of active discussion between the two, where you won't be surprised to hear our master plans have come up with some new ideas. And some things they think work really well, and actually some things could work slightly differently. So that's one aspect to it. Another aspect is where third parties have requested that we change something. And so we're in a process of dialogue, it's just sort of kicking off now with our legal advisors as to, if we were to change X, Y and Z, does that require a reconsultation? If it does, and my personal preference is we don't do that because it's delay and it costs money and it means you've got to go out and speak to everybody again, and it's perhaps a little bit confusing to the public why we're having this conversation for the third time, because most members of the public don't understand the difference between a Reg 18 and a Reg 19, and if you're going back and doing a Reg 19 for a second time, it's sort of, I thought we already talked about this. But if we do need to do it, then we will do it, and that will see another sort of 12 to 14 week consultation period. The choreography of that means, obviously we've got to avoid the pre-election period, we've got to avoid the summer, so it may be that we can't do that until after the summer. We currently plan to get the local plan through inquiry by the end of this year. If we can't do that, it means that 18 slips to 18-19. So it would mean that adoption would slip into the beginning of 19. What does all that mean in terms of what we're able to do? Well, by the time you get to a Reg 19 consultation, your local plan policies already contain such significant weight that we are actually determining planning applications against them anyway. So it's not holding us back, but clearly if we were to be in a public inquiry situation, which again I hope to avoid, on a planning application, it doesn't help that we won't have the plan adopted. So my preference is that we move forward as quickly as possible to get this plan adopted. But if we do need to change things to an extent that our legal advisors want us to reconsult again, then we will have to heed their advice. So I'm just being very sort of open and honest with you there. The biggest risk for us is having to change something significantly. And, you know, you can imagine lawyers have much fun over the word significant. So there'll be a bit to and from on that. But having said all of that, there are many planning authorities throughout this land who are now working on local plans that are over 20 years old, and we're not yet 3 years old. So I'm still very pleased with the progress that we've made with our local plan and the buy-in that we've got from all three boroughs. That's an important point to note here, that all three borough leaders endorse this local plan. So the partnership working that's gone on behind the scenes to get us to a position that everybody's happy with it cannot be underestimated.
Well, thank you for that. Just one follow-up question. You talked about new ideas. Can you give us an example of one or two of these new ideas that might cause
I'll give you an example of an old idea that might not need to be in there. I'll start with that one because that's easier. So we had a key development site within our current local plan, and bearing in mind local plan's time restricted, this key development site was also known as the Crossrail Depot. So understandably, TfL have said it's not going to be developed within the period of the local plan, within this 20-year period. Indeed, this is something our chair absolutely agrees with. We may come back and do it some sunny day later on, but for the foreseeable future, it's not a development site. Our focus is on the north, and therefore our current plan says it is a development site. So if we're to take it out, which TfL have requested we do take it out, is that a significant change that warrants a reconsultation or not? And I don't yet have the answer for that. So that's the sort of thing we're talking about. We're not talking about radical change of adding things in. We're talking about sort of a realignment of a couple of roads or bridges, which in my mind are not significant. But we do need to have that due conversation with all parties just to check that we're not doing anything that we shouldn't do.
Thank you.
Okay. We've reached the end of our set of questions for you. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed. Wish you luck for the next year, because it sounds like things may change radically before we see you this time next year talking about your budget. We're going to pause the meeting for a second while we switch our guests. Victoria and Doug are free to go, although you can stay if you want to. We're going to be talking to the police next. Anyway, we'll pause a moment. Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA.
Okay, members, we're going to move into section 2. I'd like to welcome our new guests, Siobhan Peters, the Chief Financial Officer of MOPAC, Sophie Linden, who you know very well, of course, the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Sir Craig Mackey, the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service, and whilst I've just announced you, I'd like to take the opportunity to congratulate you. I think it's probably fair to say you are a good friend to the London Assembly. You're here very often, and I think I can speak for all members in expressing our delight at your recent honour in the New Year's Honours List. Many congratulations indeed. It is very richly deserved.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the many members who contacted me. It is greatly appreciated, but I'm sure this is about doing it as a team, so it's really one for London.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and we'll now bowl you lots of bouncers about budget. I'd like to welcome Linda McMullen, the Director of Commercial and Finance at the Metropolitan Police Service, and David Galley, who we've already introduced and is still here. Welcome to all of you. I keep forgetting to do this, so before I ask the opening question, I will wish everyone a Happy New Year, because it sounds very rude when I don't do that. There we are. Okay, so the opening question is to the Deputy Mayor. It's a nice, easy one for you to start with. What does the police funding settlement mean for the Met's budget?
Well, I think the police funding settlement that the government announced just before Christmas was absolute smoke and mirrors, because it claimed to have saved policing and to be putting extra money in, where in actual fact what it has done is shifted the burden of putting some of the money, some of the investment into policing to local taxpayers in London and across the country. And it did not in any way save policing. It was flat cash that the core grant gave us. We still have to find millions of pounds worth of savings. And actually, if there is more than a 1% increase in pay, needed as it is for the very, very hard-working public servants that the police and police staff are, it will completely wipe out any extra cash that may be in the system. So the real message is we are still absolutely facing savings and cuts for London that we are very, very worried about. We are really worried that police officer numbers are going to dip significantly below 30,000 if this continues.
Okay, we're going to explore all of those issues in more detail as we move through the meeting. In June, when you appeared before us, at that time you said that 2%, or around about £4, was the right balance for Londoners to pay. The Mayor's draft budget now, of course, proposes the additional £12 on top of the other preset rise. Why has the Mayor arrived at the decision where he thinks that is a fair price for Londoners to pay?
I think the Mayor has been put in an incredibly difficult position and having to take decisions about the safety of Londoners. And in order to ensure, as far as possible he can, in the powers that he has got, that we can put the safety of Londoners really as a priority, he has had to take the difficult position to maximise the flexibility in the policing preset that the government has given him. Do we think that's right? No, we do not, because we think that actually the police core grant should be increased in real terms so that Londoners aren't having to have this burden placed upon them, a burden of financing policing in London. But that's the decision that's had to be taken. It's a very, very difficult one. We don't think it's the one that we should be pushed into the corner to take, but we've had to take it in order to try to ensure that we can make sure that the safety of Londoners really is a priority.
To play devil's advocate on that point, the government have made the point that the Metropolitan Police Service is the best funded police service in the country, has the highest proportion of police officers per head of population in the country. And of course, there is no such thing as government money, it's all taxpayers' money. So the government's defence line, I imagine, would be if London needs more money, then London can raise more money. What would you say to that?
To take your first point around, is London the best funded police force in the country? We've had this argument many times in this discussion, many times probably in this committee, but I've certainly had this discussion face to face with the Minister for Policing. We absolutely refute that because those figures are based on per capita, that is per individual person living in London. Now we all know London is a fantastic city. It has thousands of millions of tourists every year, but it also has just people coming in every day to work in London. So that figure based on per capita is really not a fair comparison because it doesn't take into consideration the numbers of people that the Metropolitan Police are having to police in London every day, commuters, tourists, visitors, and nor does it take into consideration the cost of policing London, which is significantly different to the cost of policing the rest of the country, and that's why we have things like London waiting for salaries and wages. We know that policing London is just more expensive. And of course, again, it then doesn't take into consideration the long-standing argument that we've had with the government around the London being a capital city and how much that costs the Metropolitan Police to police. We know that the National International Capital Cities grant is underfunded. The main policing grant is having to soak up that extra money. So there's many reasons why that figure, which is often thrown back at us by the government, had those discussions face to face with the Minister, that we don't accept that figure because it isn't a fair like-for-like comparison with what the Metropolitan Police Service has to pay in order to police London.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Linda McMullen. The summer was a very tricky time for policing in London before terrorist attacks and the Grenfell fire. Now, the special grant, police special grant, which is available if forces, I think it's 1% of your gross budget. If anything, any special incident exceeds that, you can apply for special funding back from the government. My understanding is that none of those incidents on their own require or met that standard. Have you been in touch with the Home Office and asked for any funding from that grant, and if so, what was the response?
Yes, so we have had those conversations with the Home Office, and they have indicated that they do feel that the 1% issue isn't fair. So I think we have moved quite substantially in terms of our conversations with Home Office, which is incredibly welcome. We've obviously got sort of two areas that we're looking for special grant this year, both of which the Home Office have indicated that they will fully fund. As you mentioned, we have had those terrorist incidents. We've got a claim in at the moment with Home Office for 7.8 million. We did get some funding through the National CT funding that came from Treasury Department. We had some of that sort of funding which we've received already. We are going through the process with Home Office at the moment for the 7.8 million that's outstanding. We have been given informal assurances that that money has been set aside for us. They've had those figures since November, so they are working through that. They have put that into their sort of current accounting. The other issue, which is probably much more substantial for us, has been the impact of Grenfell. That has had a very sort of significant impact. And we're equally put in a special grant claim for the current year of 11.1 million in terms of the additionality of cost for that sort of incident for the current financial year. We've also sort of indicated that we would like, we estimate that next year we will be spending close to £27 million on that particular investigation. So we're asking whether or not we can also have a dispensation, not just simply the 1% that you've referenced, but we also want to claim the full cost of our officer time for that investigation, not just the additionality, the overtime in effect, because we do think we have approximately about 200 officers that will be working on that over the next sort of year. We don't think that it's reasonable for us to pick up those sort of full costs. As we know, that sort of investigation will go on for some time. So I think we are sort of pleased where those conversations have gone to. We do need to we do actually need the money back, but we have been given those informal assurances at this stage.
Just to clarify my understanding, firstly, it's good news to hear that the Home Office are being flexible around this. That is good. The 7.8 million that you mentioned, that was around the counter-terrorism money, is that correct? So
those are around the terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
So in terms of the cost of those attacks, there are some sort of CT elements to that that we've obviously incurred, which we have already received money. So Treasury provided CT nationally, I think it was £24 million. So we've been able to draw down some of that money already. But obviously the impact of Westminster, etc., has had quite a significant impact on territorial policing as well. So the 7.8 relates to that sort of that wider sort of impact that we're claiming.
Okay, because my understanding of the cost of the London Bridge attack is it was around about £10 million to the Met. Is that correct?
That sounds correct. I haven't got the exact figures with me. I can come back and confirm.
So there's been an element of CT money that's been provided. The 7.8 million that we're talking about is on top of that, but that's for collectively for the 4 attacks rather than just one. Okay, that's good. The conversation that you're having with the government about the £27 million cost of the Grenfell investigation, where are you at with that? It sounded like the Home Office were making pleasant noises, but has anything been firmed up?
So in terms of the incremental cost, obviously the existing rules absolutely provide for those sort of incremental costs for next year. So I'm very confident in terms that we will get those overtime costs, etc., as part of that next year. The issue that we are pushing at is really sort of the argument that we would like to have full cost rather than just the incremental cost for next year because of the impact. Given our sort of reduction in numbers of officers, it doesn't seem reasonable that we would absorb that sort of full cost of those 200 officers next year.
Yes, but what are the Home Office saying in terms of that? Because I think most of the members on this side of the room would agree with you that it is not reasonable. Similarly, there is quite a large degree of cross-party support around police funding generally in London. But it's all very well us all agreeing that this is reasonable. We need the Home Office to agree. So what indications have they given to you that they agree with you?
So I think those of us that work with civil servants, they never quite give you that sort of assurance. I think the assurance that we do have is they think that we've got a very good case. They are willing to put that case up to ministers as part of the funding for next year for them to consider. So we've got assurance that it is being sort of seriously considered, not to put anybody in a difficult position in the Home Office.
Have they indicated to you that they would put that case to ministers with a recommendation that the ministers approve it, or just that they would put it on the table neutrally and so it's up to you?
I'm not sure that they ever sort of fully sort of recommend in that way. They certainly think that we've got a strong case to make that, and they're very happy to put that case forward on our behalf.
Yes, that sounds like a very careful civil service answer, to be honest, which I don't entirely blame you for that. Before we move off the question of the special grant, so the Home Office have shown flexibility around the 1%. They've recognised that there is an exceptional, in the wrong way, summer. Have they indicated that that means that they are going to review the 1% hard edge in the future, or is this just a one-off?
So we've had that conversation as well. Their view is it's custom and practice about the 1%. It's not necessarily baked in terms of sort of legislation or sort of statute that it is 1%. So we've been having the discussion about whether or not they just need to be much more explicit that 1% is kind of not sort of binding. I think sort of given the sort of position Manchester have been in as well, I think they do realise that the arbitrary 1% is just isn't realistic. It is not really sort of holding. And I think the other bit of the debate that this sort of ties into quite closely is government is, as you sort of probably are aware, putting a lot of pressure on sort of forces in terms of the amount of reserves that we hold. And I think if there isn't a safety valve like sort of special grant, it does encourage people to hold more reserves, if that makes sense as well. So I think both of those sort of conversations come together quite nicely.
Okay. Now, the other key battleground really with police funding, which has been ongoing for quite a while now, is the issue of the National and International Capital City grant. And what even the Home Office agree is an underfunding. I know there's a discrepancy on the figures between what the Met value that, what value the spend as, and what the Home Office pay, and also what the Home Office have valued it at. Nevertheless, it hasn't moved this year. So does this year's police grant signal an end to your battle on that, or is this something that will be ongoing?
No, I think certainly at an operational level we still feel very, very strongly about that. It ties into the question you were asking the Deputy Mayor about that sort of comparable sort of funding, and HMIC, FRS as they now are, equally sort of recognise that fact that it's very difficult to compare like for like when we don't get that sort of funding for those sort of national responsibilities. We certainly, and I think probably all of us, continue to have those conversations. The latest conversations that I have been having is that Home Office are quite wedded to reviewing NIC at the same time as they review the overall sort of funding formula. I don't agree with that position, but that is the government's position on NIC, and they do not seem to be budging on that at all.
The valuation of NIC, both the Met's valuation in terms of how much it costs and the Home Office's valuation in terms of how much they give you, it dates back to, I think, 2015. Has there been any work done, because I imagine that cost is now not meaningful, has there been any work done to revalue that?
We haven't done any additional work at this stage. We have had some conversations with Home Office about updating, so things that we know have changed. So we know what the sort of bulk of it is. I think one of the issues from our perspective, when we went into the last very deep review, this does take an awful long time to do properly. If there's no meaningful expectation of somebody doing something with that information, that becomes quite a difficult issue for us, because it isn't simply an exercise for finance staff in the Met. This is an exercise that takes an awful lot of time of our officers, in particular in our sort of serious and organised crime areas, who are quite busy at the moment. So we have got some of that sort of balancing to do between putting an awful lot of time into redoing that work at a substantial level and the expectation of any result from it. I think we absolutely are committed in terms of, we've had the indication through provisional settlement that funding formula review is back on the table for 2021, and certainly the Deputy Mayor and the Deputy Commissioner have been having the conversation about how we align and get that sort of work freshened up to inform that next piece of work, which we will absolutely do.
You said something interesting there that I wasn't aware of. The funding formula review, obviously there was one attempted, I think it was June 2015, wasn't it? And it, about this time, well, it was about Christmas time 2015, and it was botched and they had to pull it and then redo it. Then we heard that there was going to be something announced in the summer and the election got in the way. Now it's going to be 2021. It's settled that it said that in the provisional settlement we got on the 18th of December. Yeah. So we've got 2 years, I suppose, before a new funding formula hits, if they keep to that timetable that we indicated in the provisional settlement. Okay. So does that mean they've gone back to first principles in terms of calculating the funding formula? I've had no conversation at this stage to understand whether or not they're going to pick up and continue or go back and start again. We've not had those conversations yet since Christmas. This is interesting. And as my colleague just sort of whispered in my ear, that could be an election year, but then of course any year could be an election year these days. So I suppose you can plan around elections because they're not predictable anymore.
Can't be right. I thought your government had introduced fixed term parliaments.
That was the coalition government.
Oh, that was the coalition.
I blame the Liberals for that. Anyway, we're going to move on now, and we're going. Oh, sorry, no, there are two members. Actually, firstly, I saw Assemblymember Duval and then Assemblymember Berry.
Can we just go back to the funding supplement about, look, on the NIC funding, I recognise the enormous task it is and the pressures it places, but in terms, given the circumstances where we are, we can't afford not to do something. So is there a case of going back over certain parts to do some updating? Because, 2015, I think we were fighting facing very different challenges in some of that working area. We're now 2018, so I think we can't afford not to do that work. So I just would like that reassurance around that. In terms of the breakdown of the counter-terrorism funding, the 50 million nationally, I suppose it's to Craig. Yeah. Is that for both intelligence or policing services, or just purely for policing?
As I understand the way that's announced, it's just for policing.
It's just for policing?
Yes.
So, yeah. And is that fair then? Is that a one-off or is that a recurring?
At the moment, it looks like a one-off.
They've
Right.
described it
Just
as
it's
a
a
one-off.
one-off.
So it's a one-off, and I presume it's for capacity building, or is it for facing some of those one-off costs that you're in negotiations with?
Well, it's not clear at the moment whether it's capacity, capability, or cost.
Okay.
And that's part of the
So
work
given-
we're doing at the moment.
So given where you are on
Yes.
your estimates now, of that, let's say it is for not capacity building, well, it's for both. Let's
Yeah.
say it's for both. Of 50 million, what could we expect? What would you expect if on fair, on a fair field, not over the top, on a concept that we should be expecting for the MPS out of that 50 million?
Well, usually, I'm just trying to think how they work pro rata across the network. Usually about 65% of that money would come to this part of the network. But I think that's the advantage, and we saw that tragically this year, the network flexes, but about 65% of central spend
and there may well
ends
be-
up spend in London.
And there may be areas that, presumably we're in for a bit for past actions. Manchester will
Yes,
be in for
yeah.
a bit. And there may well be some capacity building
Yeah.
in some other areas where we need to strengthen, we're all in this together,
Yeah,
to be honest,
absolutely.
rather than just that, but recognising where London is. So thank you for that. Can I just go back to this 130 then, additional funding nationally for priorities and special grants, which again is the pot where we'd be looking at Grenfell and other sort of high priority issues, isn't it?
Yes.
That sort of,
Yeah.
and that's all one-off funding, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you not think then, given your financial circumstances, this Assembly should recommend to the Mayor that we need to, and I think you mentioned it, Linda, we need to see a plan about how you use that one-off funding. Some of it will be for reserves. I think you're right that there needs to be some of that flexibility for the future challenges we face. But shouldn't we be saying to the Mayor in terms of good practice, thanks very much, the finances and the Met are this, we now need to see a plan about how you use of any money that you get back. So if you get back, I think you mentioned a figure of 29 million, was that for Grenfell? Was that a figure, if I misquoted you? 27.
Yeah.
Well, a few million here and there. In terms of that, but let's say 27, when that comes back into the Met, shouldn't we be demanding of you some creativity about how that's used in tackling crime across London, or how you're going to use that for either future challenges that you face? How does it work?
Just to be clear, that money's already incurred against direct costs.
I know it's incurred. You've spent it already.
Yeah.
I could say thanks very much. You've spent it already.
Yeah.
Why do you need any more then?
Well,
But you're going to get it back. So what's it moved? It goes back in. It's not. You've spent it, haven't you? You're not on tick, are you?
No,
So
well,
the 27
Well, are you on
million
tick?
is the money that we expect to spend
receive that.
next year,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
So it comes back for you from central. Let's say you're successful in all your negotiations and you get back everything you want, and that money comes back into the system. That money would have been spent, but you've spent that already. It's not on tick, is it? It comes back into the system.
So
Or does it? Or is it an accountancy?
So the
issue?
27 million for next year,
Yeah.
which hopefully is baked into government sort of figures. So part of that, so in terms of the core cost of 200 cops is baked into our budget, but we haven't baked in money for additionality, the sort of overtime or whatever else. So I think your point is some of that will be against sort of new cost.
Because it's
Some-
one-off, isn't it?
Some of that will allow us to potentially have more officers. So I think that if and when we get that sort of confirmation of funding next year, so what we don't know at this stage is whether or not they'll fund the bit against the officer core sort of costs. That would be additionality, which absolutely would then give the Deputy Mayor some sort of choice.
So to explain to me how, I should know this, but just explain to remind me, so how will we use that one-off money in terms of the budget of recruiting the officers that we're going to get then? How does that work?
So there would be choices. So we'll, if we get that sort of, so some of that money, one-off money, will be against the one-off cost.
Yeah.
In terms of overtime. But the other sort of half of it will be against establishment, which will then give some sort of choices to use that money in a one-off way.
Yeah, I still want to press my claim then. I think we should demand of you, in a bit of financial discipline, a bit more about when and how you spend that money and make those choices in a bit more of a transparent way. Because it's tough, isn't it? It's getting tougher. This settlement, I think, like the Deputy Mayor says, doesn't solve the policing issues. It gives you a bit more confidence about bridging some of your gaps in future years, or part of those gaps, substantially, but it's a lesser service. Let's be honest about this. It's still a lesser service that we're planning to have, both in officer numbers and probably in delivery.
But I think why it's important around that 26.9 million for next year is if we don't get all of that back, it means that on your borough there's two people who are shown as posted to that operation, or whatever the numbers are, they're gone. What we do if we get all of that money back, it gives us some potential options that we can then discuss with the Deputy Mayor.
Fine. And I'm looking for transparency about those and how that features in the budget and those choices that are made year on year. If they're made yearly, they may be longer term issues where you make that's a decision that's what we're going to try and do over a couple of years.
So I think that transparency comes through our monitoring. So if we do get that additionality that we are at this moment not baking in because we can't bank on government sort of changing their rules around it, then it comes through that sort of monitoring, and that's where the transparency comes.
I think this all does need to be set in the context of this is flat cash settlement, 3% inflation. So even if it does come out as additionality, it's actually going into in some ways it's not additionality at all, because actually what we're looking at is having to make year-on-year savings. So it's not that we'll suddenly have a little bit of extra money. We'll have to look at how we might be able to reallocate it into some of our savings. It's not that it's going to actually tip us over into real terms increases. It's filling a hole. And we've really, I think with all this discussion around any of the money from the settlement, it has to be seen in that context of the flat cash settlement, 3% inflation, rising demand, and we have still millions of pounds of savings to be made.
Yeah, I'm very clear about what this means and where it is. I just think the circumstances demand some extra disciplines that we need to take on board about where that cash is being spent, how it's being allocated. I'd even go so far, I do think we ought to, in terms of the negotiations with government, much that we receive their grant, we are subsidising the counter-terrorism issue. I'll be very clear about that, and that's why I'm very clear about that should be an up-to-date figure. Yeah. I wouldn't wish to take that away. I wouldn't use that as a bargaining chip. That's not why I'm raising it. I want government to understand there is a subsidy going from ordinary policing. It's all tackling crime. But in terms of that to a more specialised area of tackling crime, which there should be some national responsibility, a greater burden. So I'm just looking for clarity on those issues, and why I think the Chair was raising why we need to, I think, update. If we can't do it all, then we need to do part.
On just if I may, just pick up on two things on that. I absolutely agree with you in terms of making sure that the government understands how the core Metropolitan Police budget as a particular for London is picking up costs of counter-terrorism, and that's why there has been very, very good work in looking at the Westminster Bridge attack and how much of the response to the Westminster Bridge attack came from core Metropolitan Police, and those are the figures of £1 from counter-terrorism, £2 from the Metropolitan Police. So we have those figures, and we have given them to the government, and we use that often in discussions. The second thing I would say in terms of the NIC funding, yes, in the future, when we look at the funding formula review and going down, of course you have to have the most up-to-date figures. However, the argument with the government and the government's argument with us isn't that they don't accept the figures. It really is about, are they prepared to fund it? And that's my worry about reopening NIC at the moment, is actually we know what we're owed. The government know what they owe us. They're just not prepared to give it to us.
I think it's just going to morph, isn't it, into formula funding issues. And as the Chair said, a general election at any time, but let's say 2021, those issues, what I think is a real problem for London is we've got, with the Metro mayors arriving on the scene, this issue of divide and rule, and not seeing a common interest about actually for the dividing of that cake and what needs to happen, and everyone will be grabbing everything. And there is a problem of policing costs outside London, which I'm conscious of was, you know.
And I think that's why the important point Linda made, our position all the way through this, is you've got to separate Nick and the funding formula. Otherwise,
it's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, but we've got to keep pushing for that. Otherwise, it's not a proper assessment.
Assemblymember Berry.
Yes, I just wanted to ask a couple of further questions on the council tax side of things. Last year, the police portion of the precept was put up by the maximum, but the rest of the council tax wasn't. Something I argued for in our budget amendment was to do the whole thing, transfer it to the police and spend it on youth services. It could have been spent on any item of policing, I think. The committee here in its pre-budget report suggested that that should be done, that the whole of the council tax precept should be put up and spent however the mayor thought best. And this year that has happened. The mayor has put up the whole of the council tax by the maximum that the government have announced, 2.99%. 1 percentage point of that is coming off and going back into the police, the rest is going to the fire service. So I wanted to ask Sophie, I know this is a mayoral decision at the top of the GLA, but do you know what prompted this change in policy and did you argue for it?
So I think in terms of the mayor has made the decision, as is out to draft consultation around putting up the council tax. We are in a position where both the fire and the police, emergency services in London is drastically underfunded. So he has had to take that decision to put that council tax up as far as he can to ensure that that can be not just the police services but the fire service as well can be properly funded. In terms of why that decision was made, because he's taken the safety, and as he did last year and will continue to do, taking the safety of Londoners incredibly seriously around policing but also around fire services as well.
Yeah, I definitely welcome it. I have a question for David, I think, which is the first one we've got for you. David, do you know, you might not know this off the top of your head, but do you know the effect of not putting up the council tax for the rest of the GLA group last year on this year's base and thus the amount we could have raised this year?
Not offhand. I'll happily supply that detail.
Is that something
to
we
you.
could ask you for? Yeah. Thank you.
I think that is a good question, and it does matter. So I think we will write to you after the meeting, and we will request that information. Are we done? Okay, we're going to move on to the next section, which is the very politically uncontentious issue of police officer numbers. And Assemblymember Prince is going to lead for us on that.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning. It's questions for both Craig and for Sophie, first of all. Perhaps you might like to have a go first, Sir Craig, and my personal congratulations on your well-deserved elevation.
Thank you.
How will moving down to 30,000 officers, dying up at the moment there, 30,000 officers change the Met's approach on crime?
I think, as you've started to see, it's changed in a number of ways. It means we have to be more prescriptive in how we prioritise and use those resources. I hope in some of the answers to the earlier questions, when we talked about some of those additional pressures that the Met faces, you see how we're having to make really, really difficult choices in terms of what we prioritise and what we can do. There's been a lot of talk recently and a lot of media coverage about things like crime screening, screen attendance. Those are real decisions we're having to make in order to make a model of 30,000 officers work effectively for London. So the work we've done on things like the strengthening local policing, the work we're doing on mobility, all of those things are designed to support working at a model of 30,000 officers for London. So what you're seeing is an increasing prioritisation of workloads. You're seeing increasingly decisions where we get extra pressures on work, having to be really, really clear when there's a demand to do something new or take something on, all right, what gives in the system to be able to make those work. So we're confident in the model as it works at the moment that we can get a working model that works at 30,000 officers. We're quite confident in that. It's as we go further down in years to come, there's further work to do.
Thank you. So if you would like to have a stab at that one.
So just building on what Craig has said, in terms of the 30,000 officers, as you know, we've had many discussions at the Police and Crime Committee around this. We are having to take some really serious decisions and around transformation of the Met, one of which is the basic command units, controversial as they are in terms of looking at the restructuring around that. That is in order to be able to deliver a service to London at 30,000. My concerns, and I've been given assurances that it is possible to police London at those numbers, that as has been said, if they go below 30,000, which is absolutely what is in, if we continue on the budget trajectory we are on, we are going to significantly fall below 30,000 police officers. That is going to put the safety of Londoners at risk. 30,000 police officers, demand is rising, it's stretching the police, it's stretching the services. And this is on top of, the police can only, if we take knife crime and the terrible murders and tragedies that have happened over New Year, we know that the police are only one part of trying to tackle knife crime, trying to tackle all sorts of different parts of crime. And they are having to deal with partners who are in similar situations where their budgets have been cut. Sian has already talked about the youth services having an impact on youth crime and the ability of the police to really be able to divert young people away from crime. So whilst 30,000 officers it can cope with it, it is not ideal in any sense because we know demand is rising, population of London is rising, the young population of London is rising, and that comes with it some complexities, comes with great opportunities as well, but great challenges in terms of policing. It is a real worry.
So, is that the new promise now then, 30,000 police officers?
We're committed to absolute lobbying. With the budget, as you know, the budget that we put forward has taken the money out of the budget in order to come down to 30,000 in order to set a balanced budget. Would I prefer not to be doing that? Absolutely. I would prefer to be putting more money into policing and getting more frontline officers out there in the communities. The promise that we've had all along is to absolutely lobby government for the money and the funding that the Metropolitan Police needs to police London.
See, what I don't understand, and I do accept what you're saying, but what I don't understand is when the Mayor came to office, he promised 32,000. When the Mayor came to office, he was aware of all the budget savings that were required of the Met. Those budget savings haven't changed. They're still the same as they were the day he took office as they are today. The funding for the Met hasn't reduced from what was proposed when he took office, and indeed when you took office. And what I can't understand is, he made a promise then of 32,000. You're now saying you are trying to keep to 30,000, but it might have to go down. What has changed?
What the commitment in the Police and Crime Plan was to set a strategic target of 32,000 officers, and that was a strategic target. But as we had discussions last year, we were very clear that that target was not going to be met last year because of the funding settlement that we had. And the commitment was to absolutely lobby the government to get the investment that is needed in policing. That hasn't happened. And on top of that, there has been an increase in demand, an increase in counter-terrorism. It's a shift, not a spike. And there's been an increase, we've seen an increase in recorded crime. What we've had to do is right-size the budget for where we are at the moment. Do we want to be in this place? No, we do not. But that is because of the funding and the investment that we have got.
But when, I don't want to go into this too deeply, but when you set that strategic target of 32,000, you were aware of what funding was available to the police in that year, this year, next year, and the following year. And none of that has changed. You were aware that the police had to make savings of, I think, £600 million off the top of my head. That hasn't changed. None of that. So when you made that promise, that strategic promise, you were aware of all these pressures that the Met were under. Of course, when you took over, the performance of the police was better than it is now, but we won't go into that. But what has changed? And in fact, now the government are offering, albeit via London taxpayers, more money. So what has changed?
In terms of setting the strategic target, which we did in the Police and Crime Plan, and as you know, we have had to, through this budget, we no longer have that strategic target. What has changed is an increase in demand, increase in counter-terrorism, an increase in complexity and vulnerability of that the police are having to deal with. But also what has changed is that we were in the middle of a funding formula review where we wanted and we were making very, very strong representations around ensuring that London got what it deserved. What has changed is that we are not there. As we've heard today, it's been pushed back to 2021. We've got to accept what we have at the moment and set a balanced budget which, unfortunately, do we want to be doing this? No, we do not, but unfortunately is having to take money out of the budget and take officers off the streets of London in order to set a balanced budget because of the money that we have got from the government.
I'm going to move on, but
Before you do, Assemblyman Prince, there's a number of follow-up questions I wouldn't mind asking on police officer numbers, and I think other members would as well.
Okay, I'll just say what I was going to say, and then by all means. First of all, let's not be under any misunderstanding. We fully support, especially around Nick, trying to help to get a better settlement on that. We fully support that the police need more funding. But in fact, and I'm sure Craig will be able to verify this, there was a great fear that had the police formula funding changed, I think Craig can confirm this, there was a fear that London would be actually worse off. I think that's what we were...
And that's still a real risk with any funding formula review.
So, when all these assumptions were made, you're in a better position in relation to the extra money that the government's giving via Londoners, and also the fact that we don't have that sword of Damocles hanging over us at this minute in time in relation to the formula funding.
We are in a really difficult position. I find it really difficult, I don't see how you can in any way say we are in a better position. London and the Metropolitan Police is facing substantial cuts. Flat cash, I keep saying it, but flat cash is a cut. We've got inflation at 3.1%, increase in demand. We have identified £183 million of savings, and that is in the budget in the coming years, and we are going to have to make more savings on top of that. And it could be even more depending on what happens with the police staff and police pay rise. London is not in a good position. It is in no way in a better position. It is in a very, very difficult position. That's about safety.
I accept what you're saying, Sophie, but the point is that all these pressures that we were aware of, or virtually all these pressures, I won't go into the other side of things, were in place when you were appointed.
Thank you. I think part of this is the disparity between facts and figures and money and messaging, and I think that probably gets to the heart of what this debate is about at the moment. Getting back to facts and figures, Craig, how many warranted police officers does the Met have today?
Gosh, today, turn of the year, I think we were
nearest
300. 30,300, I think, was the last figures I saw, which are just pre-Christmas. So I've not seen any post-Christmas.
Okay. So you're operating on 30,003, because I think last year it was about 31,200 from memory. Is that about right?
That was the peak, yeah.
Because the difference between that 31,200 and the 32 that was the target was the 38 million that was taken out of police staff.
Yeah.
So we're talking about assuming 30,000 officers, which is 300 fewer than now, which would be natural wastage in this year. Is that correct?
Yes. So you'll know, and we've discussed at this committee before, we need about a 9-month glide path to manage these things. Yeah. We've always been very clear with the support of the Deputy Mayor. We don't just stop and start recruitment. We want to keep recruitment coming all the time in an organisation and at the size of the Met. So it's about a 9-month lead-in.
Okay. So what would be the significant difference in today's uniformed officers, or sorry, warranted officers, and the 30,000 that you're talking about?
Sorry, what would be the significant...
How much difference would that make in terms of operational policing?
Well, some of the areas that people will notice a difference, so the work we've done around changing the way we do public access, the work around strengthening local policing, which is the work around both BCUs and some of those areas, the work we're doing around streamlining leadership, where we're taking leaders out of the organisation at various levels. So those are the differences you'd know. And that, across the piece, adds up to just about 2,000 officers, 1,800 to 2,000 officers.
So you're actually planning to go below 30?
No, that's how we've come down. So we're to be very clear, we're planning on 30,000.
Okay.
But how do you get from 32 to 30? Yeah. There's a plan with detail of how we've and where officer roles will come out as we do the transformation
But
programme.
the reality is that we haven't been at 32 for about 5 years, have we?
Well, we were up above 31, so we've come down. But where does the organisation feel it at the moment? Probably if you talk to officers on boroughs, they feel it the most. Because you remember we've spoken before about the time lag we've had getting detectives through the system. So we've tended to carry gaps in the detective bit and then be overstrength in some of the areas around boroughs. They're now, as they're coming down to what are their real establishments in this new world, are starting to feel that.
Okay. The fear that's been expressed a number of times is that, and the Deputy Mayor did so in her remarks earlier on, that we might fall significantly below 30,000, and various figures have been bandied around, which may or may not hold weight. How could we fall significantly below 30,000 by 2021, bearing in mind, of course, that police officers cannot be made redundant?
You work with an organisation, so the Met, as a police force, turns over between 1,600 and 1,800 people a year naturally. Some years there's little spikes depending on what happened 30 or 35 years.
Your average attrition is about 650 a year, isn't it?
Aggregate.
Sorry? Your aggregate attrition in terms of losing officers is about 650, isn't it?
No, you can actually increase it if you slow down recruitment as well. So if you stopped all recruitment, you could lose close to somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 a year, depending on what's going on. As I say, it's not a recommended model to stop recruitment and shrink at that rate.
Okay, that's where I wanted to get to. Okay, that's fine.
Can I finish?
Yes, back to Assemblymember Prince. I've seen you, Assemblymember Desai. I've got you, Assemblymember Pidgeon, and Assemblymember Deval as well, who want to come in on this.
So I want to move on to the additional funding. So if anyone wants to talk prior to that, I'm happy to give way, if that helps.
Is it on police numbers?
What numbers and what it means for the method?
Okay, well, in order, I saw Assemblymember Pidgeon first. Is it on police numbers?
Sort of not, it's
something else.
come in at the end.
Okay, in which case, Assemblymember Desai.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, the lead question really was about moving down to 30,000 officers. How would that change the Met's approach to crime? So, Craig, if I could ask you, looking at it from the perspective of the ordinary Londoner out there, whether it's 30,000, 26,000 or whatever, there was an article in yesterday's Times, rather sensationalist headline maybe, but it's titled, Met is giving up on non-serious crime. And in response to budgetary cuts, it's lists various sort of things that you may not be doing in the future. And it's based on your new crime assessment policy.
Yeah.
Have you got any comments about this article?
Yes, I spoke on, where are we, Tuesday, in terms of to some of the media outlets around that issue. It goes back to the questions a number of you have asked. You know, how do you get and manage an organisation as you start to reduce numbers? You have to look, as everyone does, we see it with the health service, we see it with many other walks of life, both public and private, you have to prioritise those things you can look at and investigate further. That's what that screening policy is around. You know, and let's be clear, and I've said this before, you know, I've got over 33 years in police. We prioritised 33 years ago. We write it down now, we talk about what it is, and we explain it. That's the big difference. And a lot of that stuff in the crime screening policy is around saying those things where, based on a risk, based on threat and harm to the individuals involved, that you're going to continue to prioritise or not. That's what the crime screening policy is. Virtually, I've worked in 4 other police forces. They all use crime screening policies.
Okay. Assemblymember Deval?
But that's it. 4 crime screening policies, probably all different. The Met needs consistency. Isn't the issue about, as we reduce down now, is having that one approach across so everybody knows what they can expect from you? If I contact the police for X, Y, Z, policing by consent means we have a little dialogue going on here, not me and you, actually you and the public,
yes,
as in the MPS.
Yeah.
And I don't see that too much, Craig, in just picking that up.
Yeah.
I do agree that where we are in our finances for you to do the job, it's a different type of service. One of the criticisms of either borough mergers, it looks like more of the same. I know that's not true, but it does. So in terms of some of the issues of relating the budget back to the delivery of service and what we can expect, or what's the different style of policing can we expect, and what are the tricks that tricks is the wrong word, I don't mean that in misleading anyone, but what are the new tools of the trade that's going to try to, because you can't make it where we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, differently about the level of resources you've got. But how do we ameliorate it? How do we protect our citizens from high armed crime? But also, we know that some low-level crime leads on to high armed crime.
Yeah.
So I think the issue then starts to demand that maybe the initial cuts transformation programme that the Met's doing, we now need to see in your budgets a different form, or what's the next steps, because that 9-month leading time, it takes time for change to happen inside the Met.
Yeah.
And there are some issues here that's not helped by the lack of experience, the inexperience. Good people doing a good job, but they're inexperienced sometimes in doing that job. They've got to build that up because we've lost a lot of experience. So I think really, I suppose my first question about police numbers and the style of policing, capacity issues, how we're going to deal with it over the next, is getting beyond a year budget, but over the next 5 years, beyond that next 5 years, what are the plans? When can we be clear? When are we going to have that conversation with the public at the moment? One of my written questions will come down, when are you going to start talking to the public about reorganising borough mergers, or are they just going to hear that out of the blue? What happens, do you know what I mean, in that sense?
Yeah.
So tell us your thinking about that in relation to officer numbers.
So in relation to where we are at the moment, so the 30,000 we've spoken about, and we've talked about the things we're doing to change that. So in both here and the Police and Crime Committee, we've spoken about the move to online reporting for crimes and for other incidents in terms of it. We've talked about what we call Virtual 101 and some of those sorts of offers. So it's a very different style and change and approach. And some of those offers now online are showing huge success and increase in volumes of reporting coming into us. So there has been a shift and there has been a move in those sorts of things. It's also allowing officers, and what the crime assessment policy allows people to do as well, is to have a realistic conversation with victims and manage people's expectations right at the start of the process, rather than what we've done in the past, and I've been as guilty of it as an officer or anyone else, take all the details and say someone will be in contact with you, and away. It's if you're saying, look, I've done this, I've looked at this, I've spoken to neighbours either side, this is not going to be detected. This is an event that's closed, it's over. If any of your property's recovered, we come back to you, etc. So it's putting those in. But I actually agree, I fundamentally agree with you. The issue is around getting the business change, which sounds a horribly technical word, but in reality, what operational officers do change, that's the bit that takes the time. And that's the bit, you know, from the work we've done with both pilots in boroughs, where we've done things like My Investigation, where officers are carrying investigative workload, that's the bit that takes the time. That's why we're doing that now. Where we go when we go below 30,000, so you look further out in the budget, that's the work that's ongoing at the moment in terms of, okay then, so what in that already prioritised list, if you had to go further, where do you go in terms of that? What are the next big things that will free up issues and savings? I mean, we're going to talk about at some point the technology transformation. You look at the rollout, something like 4,000 laptops and pilots already out in terms of the, tablets in terms of the out on. That is freeing up officer time. It is giving them capacity to do more, because as Deputy Mayor said, everything we're doing has to be seen against the fact that actually demand, calls for service, everything else is rising. So we're not just trying to build a model that works for something that's very stationary and static. It's actually against a rising model. And your engagement with the public, and I think it's a really interesting point, because increasingly what I think we're going to see happening, and there are some examples of this already, the engagement will happen at a very local level, because I agree with you to a point around a one Met-wide service response, but that does assume that the problems in every one of 32 localities, 64 localities, 80 localities are the same. One of the plans with BCUs is it still gives the flexibility to have very local priorities, where you might even go as far as having a different response.
So but that's the wiggle room, the different response.
I don't mean emergency. Sorry, to be clear, I don't mean emergency response.
Right, okay.
I mean,
and
I mean response as in a generic term.
There may well be different crime challenges in different boroughs, but the consistency in response, whatever the crime is, it should be the same.
Yeah.
And where there's inconsistency, we need to get to the bottom.
Yeah.
Of it. Can I just say, in terms of allocations of officers to the various tasks, do we now, and should we now, again, because the circumstances we're in, because we know 30,000 isn't going to be 30,000. It will be, because of recruitment drag and some of the issues and flexibilities, is down to 29. I think we get to dangerous levels when we're down to 26, 27, given the size of the population of London and the capacity of what we need to do. Rough formulas to merge units, allocations of officers, and then the emphasis on performance.
Yeah.
Right. Is that changing, or is there a new way of thinking about how you're monitoring performance, and where does that go in terms of this budget? Can I see, can I track some of those changes through the budget changes you're making or the transformation programme you're making about that emphasis on performance and about the quality of policing that we should expect? Because there is a gap now developing between the Met and the Inspectorate. I think that's increasing. I see these signs of where you are resisting some of the issues of what your inspectors are saying you should be doing in some areas, and what you think you're providing a reasonable service, and some of their issues. And the controversial ones are simple, but I just see a trend in some of your responses on that, and that's going to be down to police numbers and about capacity. So,
and I would say that's not just a Met issue. If you talk to colleagues in policing, and I think I'm on the record of talking about saying one of the frustrations at the moment, and I think the Inspectorate are getting better at this, is recognising the context in which we operate. So with a reducing budget, reducing officer numbers, and then saying everything's the latest new priority is probably not a sustainable model. And I think that the Inspectorate are getting much, much better at the way they approach that. And I think if you look at some of the things they've got planned around risk-based inspections, linked to force management statements, you can start to see a new model of inspection emerging. Because, as we move into a different costing model of policing, as we go 2-3 years out, we're going to need to have the Inspectorate move in that way as well.
And there lies the problem, isn't it? You talk about the conversation about a new policing model. When is it that you come back and say, actually, we've done that first change, and we need a different type of police service for London? I'm not sure if that's politically able, but professionally, when do you go to MOPAC or to Home Office and say, we need something different here because this isn't going to work in terms of where we are? When does that happen? Because other services have started some of that conversation going back to some of the arguments and some of the policies that they had back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, about a different policing model of tackling some forms of crime, which meant that warrant officers were still important, but actually they were working mixed teams.
Yes. So I think some of that you'll see as you look out beyond 30,000 for us. So on that particular thing around things like workforce mix, that is absolutely part of the style of the modelling we're looking at the moment. But that, to reassure you, that wider debate going on behind the scenes around what's the point at which the system's under strain, I mean, the one comment I would make, regardless of what you think around settlements and those sorts of things, I think there was a general national recognition that the policing system is under an extreme level of strain. Now, whether that strain has been met, we would still argue it hasn't, but everybody did recognise that the system itself, i.e. the sustainability of doing the model as everyone's understood it for X number of years, and you commented earlier on, we know from colleagues outside London there are others who say they're in a far worse state in terms of their strain at the moment. That's why you're seeing so much work going on. So what is the sustainable model of policing? It goes to the other point that you raised in your Paying the Bill report as well. We need some long-term sustainability in terms of the funding and the announcements around it. We've got something that looks like it might be 2 years at the moment, but potentially we know what that means, that realistically during the next financial cycle, we'll have to plan for all the scenarios again, of a funding formula review, not knowing where we're going on NIC, and that's debilitating and takes a lot of work.
And just lastly, on the police officer numbers, look, I don't see or any buzz around, and I know it won't solve the answer to police numbers, but in terms of easing the burden on some aspects of policing, is the role of the specials.
No, absolutely.
And I don't think there's a much emphasis here about actually trying to recruit at peak times or at specialised crimes around that, where the emphasis was in the past when we had quite more resources.
Yes.
And somehow I don't pick that up in this budget.
Yeah.
Tell me if I'm being fair or unfair.
No.
And I just think that that's something that needs to be looked at urgently. And I don't think you can see this in terms of as in managing numbers of what is the reserve. What is it can you call on other duties? Can you use specials to do that?
The specials are still very much part of it and very much part of the drive around the budget. The reality is at the moment that a lot of the recruiting effort has been focused around keeping those officer numbers. Because the other reassurance I'll give you, so the issue, and we look at this collectively monthly around recruiting profiles, is we can be really much sharper about keeping it at the 30,000 and not waking up one morning at 28.5 and going, oh my gosh, we've got to recruit again. So there's a much closer correlation between our projections and where we actually end up. I mean, there are some things that are completely unforeseen. If there's another pension change, particularly around officers' pensions, we know people will leave.
Right, back to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. This one's for you, Sophie. As we know now, there's going to be additional income coming in. Will that be all allocated to officer pay, or do you have intention of spending some of it elsewhere?
So that's back to the beginning of the conversation, isn't it, today, about is this additional or is it, what actually happened in the police funding settlement? Any additional money is really coming from Londoners in terms of the policing precept that the Mayor has had to put up. What it may do is provide a little bit of leeway, but it doesn't, in terms of, it isn't additional money. What it is doing is filling a hole that is there, but it doesn't fill it completely or in any way half. We have still got to find millions of pounds. 183 million pounds of savings have been identified. What we're doing is working through the numbers as to what the money coming in through the precept may be able to do. But what we do know is if there is more than a 1% increase in police pay or police staff pay, it will wipe out any extra money that's coming in, and we will still have to make millions of pounds worth of savings. The priority is to protect the front line, absolutely to protect the front line, to protect the number of police officers, and that is what we will continue to do. But we are also looking, as you'll see from the budget, that we have set out a comprehensive budget which looks at how do we ensure not only do we protect the front line, but we ensure that they have the tools with which they need to do the job. Craig's already talked about rollout of tablets, body-worn video. Our police officers out in the front line need to stay there as long as they can, and they need that modern equipment in order to do that. So that is also part of the budget that we've set forward.
Yeah, but the question was, what will you do with the additional money that you're going to be getting that you weren't expecting?
And my answer is we are absolutely prioritising the front line, but that additional money, it isn't additional in that it means that we no longer have to make savings. We are having to make, it's not a backstory, it's the reality. We are having to cut police officer numbers down to 30,000.
What are you intending to do with the additional income?
And
it's not a difficult question to answer.
No, and my answer to that is that we will prioritise the front line. However, what we have got to wait to see is what will happen, for example, with things like the pressures that the police is under.
Yeah, so
police
your answer to the question
that money may well be...
No,
Sophie answered. No,
she's
please.
already answered the question.
You're attempting to answer it again, but you're talking over us. It's not very productive.
You're just saying the same thing all over again.
It's not very productive.
Len, you're not...
I'm chairing at the moment.
You are, but...
I'm chairing at the moment.
What I'm trying to do is
get... I know you're trying to do, and I want to help you do that, but you've got to allow her to finish and then come back at her. Yes? So just let her finish what she says and then you can come back at her. I'm not stopping you. I just
Well, you are, then.
No, well, you're
And
talking. Well, actually, you're talking over me now. So, I mean, you just got to stop doing that. You've got to allow someone to respond, and then you can come back. That's what I just want to hear, both of what you're having to say. So, Sophie, do you want to finish, and then Keith Prince will come back?
Thank you very much. What I was trying to say is that the answer to your question is we will absolutely prioritise the front line. However, in terms of the additional money that is coming into the policing precept, it may well all be wiped out if the police pay and police staff pay is increased by more than 1%. The government have made it very clear that any increases in staff pay will have to be found from within the money that is already there. There will be no more additional money.
Well, thank you, and that's exactly what you said earlier, and I accept the answer. And I just wanted to know, there was no trick question, what you were going to do with the additional income, and the answer to that is that you're going to prioritise front line. That's fine, but that could be a problem if there's an additional increase in police pay. That's fine, but you said that before. Thank you. Okay, so now this question is for Linda. I'm referring to page 62 on this, if it helps you.
Okay. This is when I start getting worried.
Pardon?
This is when I start getting worried.
No, don't be worried. It's a very simple question. In relation to overtime, your budget line is 101.9 on the grey line. We look at total overtime 101.9. However, this year you're forecasting an outturn of 30.4. So clearly I think we know the answers to what some of those extra overtime pressures were. But really, what you're doing is going back to where you were on the original budget in 17-18, and you flatlined the budget overtime all the way through to 21-22. And I just really wondered why you believe that overtime, demands on overtime, considering we're going to have fewer police officers than we had when the original budget was set, why you feel that that is a realistic figure as opposed to the figure that we actually incurred this year.
So in terms of why we're overspending on overtime in the current year, it's really driven by two major issues. One, we've discussed the terrorist events, and we are covered by that, so we will have increased income to offset that through the sort of special grant that we've discussed. That's one sort of major sort of driver of that difference. The other difference in terms of the driver, in terms of the current year, is we have a number of staff vacancies in areas like command and control and in some of our custody areas. So we have got to the staff budget, so we're underspending in our staff budget, but we're overspending in our officer overtime budget, so that's the other sort of issue. We have done quite a detailed analysis. We have put in an additional 2.7 million extra in terms of overtime, which we think is the real unfunded additionality of overtime. So there's about sort of £2 million in terms of our territorial policing overtime requirement, and there's roughly about sort of £1 million in our sort of serious and organised crime. We think that's a real sustained increase that isn't funded elsewhere. So clearly, I think what we perhaps need to be better at is during the year is to via money around. So we obviously don't need more money if we're spending out of sort of staff budget where we're under establishment. So that hopefully that explains why.
Okay, well that does make sense. But if we look at total pay, that is increasing. If you look at the black line above the total pay line, that is increasing. So, and we know that police numbers are going down. So if police numbers are going down, as you've already said, overtime has a habit of going in the opposite direction. If police pay is going up, as it's indicated by this analysis here, then surely the overtime will go up by a factor either in line with the pay increase, because if you pay a police officer £100 one week and £101 because he's had a 1% increase, his overtime goes up pro rata, I believe. So that's one. And also you will also have the additional pressures of lack of or fewer numbers. So that does not seem to have been taken into account in this budget line. Why is that?
So I think there's two sort of elements. So the 3 million additionality, the real additionality does take into account the inflation that we think that attracts. So we do think that is a solid number. Our view is that the going from the 32,000 to 30,000, we are very clear that is in terms of output from the output of those sort of officers is similar to the 32,000. So we're not relying on overtime to make up that sort of difference. So we are designing out going from the 32,000 to the 30,000. And there is no assumption that we will be relying on additional overtime, because in effect that would be a false economy.
I'm not sure I hear what you're saying, but so are you saying then that in 19, 20, 20, 21 and 21, 22 there'll be less overtime? Or will overtime remain at the same sort of rate, although
I think you're
albeit
correct.
with fewer numbers?
You're correct that we haven't actually put the inflation impact into 1920, 2021 and 21, 22.
Yes.
We do hold that inflation sort of figure sort of centrally. So there is a central...
But would it not be more realistic to show that in the figures?
I think you're right. So I think we can sort of look at just adjusting that and making sure that we reflect the inflation on that figure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it seems like a long time ago now, but Assemblymember Pigeon indicated.
Yeah, what I wanted to pick up is, as your budget is getting more and more pressured, you're putting everything in to keep police officer numbers at whatever level it is. So 30,000 you're aiming for this year. Does this effectively mean that some of the discretionary spend you have on other projects, investment in preventative work, is going to eventually be cut to virtually nothing?
That one?
Either of you or Craig?
Well, just from the MOPAT point of view, we have actually, in terms of the London Crime Prevention Fund, which is some of the discretionary funding we have already, last year, we announced that we were keeping that at the level it was, £72 million over 4 years. So no, we are not cutting that in terms of the London Crime Prevention Fund. But will the prioritisation, in terms, I think the wider question around will a fall in police officers mean that you are running just to keep on top of the problems that you've got at the moment, instead of being able to do more of the downstream prevention work, which we all agree is absolutely vital? It is going to be much more difficult because the police are going to be responding. There is that demand in the system. But in terms of our priorities, we absolutely want to keep that up. And where we can, we are keeping that funding up through the London Crime Prevention Fund.
And keeping those roles in. So I think when you look at modelling, let's take 2021 as we model out, what you do then around things, if we're down at 27 and a half, what do you do about things like schools officers, where we know the long-term investment is so positive in terms of what it delivers around that prevention, around the sort of the wider agendas of policing and crime-free London. Versus the demands you might already have in the system. So I think that's when you start to get into some of those difficult choices around what goes first and, do you keep? I think if you talk to most of us as professional police officers, we know you've got to keep doing the work around prevention. We know that's where the long-term benefits are.
Is there any conversation going on across government in terms of needing across agencies to invest in prevention? Because actually there's a wider cost to the system. A young person is stabbed, ends up in A&E. That's a huge cost to the health system, a huge cost to policing and criminal justice. But actually, if there's investment in prevention that stopped that in the first place, that's a saving to everyone.
Yes.
Is there any of that going on, or is it just everyone so in their silos and just trying to keep afloat?
I think it's a mixture, honestly. I think through the London Crime Reduction Board, we try to pick up some of those things. I mean, the Deputy Mayor and I chair the delivery group of that, and part of that is around understanding where there are strains in the system, so we can look at it at a London level. Some of the cross-government work is much harder to coordinate and do in terms of that, but you know, sort of the logical conclusion of your question is you end up back in some of those debates we did some years ago around things like pooled budgets and those sorts of things, or area-based budgeting, but that seems to have all gone away as far as I can tell at the moment. But sort of in terms of London, yes, absolutely. So part of the sessions with partners both across the criminal justice system and with some of the local partners is to say, what are those bits of the system that are currently under strain and why?
I think that's a very, I think that's a very kind answer in terms of the government, and I understand the reasons. However, yes, there are those discussions. I mean, I went to the Home Office before Christmas to talk about, you know, response to rising violence on the streets, and with police and crime commissioners, and we all said the police can only do so much. We have to have the mental health services there. We need the youth services, and we need education. Government hear that, but they don't then do something about it. So there may be the discussions, but what are the outcomes of those discussions? I don't see that. I mean, just before, in the autumn, there appeared to be a really good announcement around child and mental, child and adolescent mental health services. They're not coming downstream for a couple of years. It really was jammed tomorrow. And we all know how it is, you know, take knife crime, absolutely in the forefront of our minds at the moment. We know that we need the mental health services there, we need the youth services there, and we need really good supported schools to be able to support young people. We don't have that. And we keep talking about it, but actually it's the outcomes of that. On a London-wide level, Craig's absolutely right. Those are the discussions we're having, and we really are trying to pull that and bring it together. But we're dealing with reduced budgets and reduced resources, and that is a real problem. And we are seeing the outcomes of those reduced budgets and reduced resources. It has to be part of it has to be part of what's going on the streets of London at the moment.
Just going back to 12:20, this is for members' ears. We've done 2 of the 5 sections that we had set aside for this meeting. There is a little bit of a hint, but not too much of one, because budget is important. But we're moving on to the next section now, which is about digital policing.
Until 1 o'clock today, then?
Well, I think we could go until even a bit later, who knows? Let's overrun for 5. Anyway, the next section is digital policing, which is still with Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Yes, okay, to Sir Craig. We talk about digital policing a lot. Can you explain to me, apart from you mentioned earlier 4,000 laptops and tablets, what you've actually invested in so far?
Of course I can. So if you look at, and we've spoken about this a number of times at this committee, when we started on this journey around, so delivering our technology services first of all, how we deliver technology within the organisation. You'll remember we had one big supplier, one big contract, and we've gone through a long process to move to a completely different way of supplying and procuring technology in the organisation. So what does that mean if you're an operational officer? What they're seeing now, so you're seeing the largest rollout of body-worn video in the world, done.
So that's
out
part
there,
of it, yeah.
done. You see officers now, you'll see them everywhere you go with body-worn video on there, and it's not just the front end of that, because it's actually quite easy to give someone a camera. It's the back end, it's all the systems, it's the ability to access it, the ability to share it digitally straight away with the courts and with the CPS, all done, all done in terms of what we've done. We've started now the rollout of tablets for officers on foot. So if you go particularly at the moment to some of the North London and West London boroughs, you'll see officers with a tablet on foot, which basically replicates your desktop on your on a tablet. So I can do my crime report when I'm in the street, I can give you the crime number there and then, and I can do a whole load of things. And I just looked anecdotally this morning at some of the feedback. So a real example, a detective sergeant put some comments in there, works in a community safety unit in Brent. They'd had an arrest of a person wanted in the Metropolitan Police area in Luton. The officer he sent was able to download the file onto his tablet before onto his laptop before he went up there, because the detective has a laptop. Go up there, do the investigation, share the file back with the sergeant, get a charge authorised, and before he left Luton, the file's done and submitted to the CPS. So there's been some huge changes. And one of the things I was going to offer to the committee, I did think today about bringing some of the technology to show you, but in mindful of time, you've probably been here all afternoon. So the offer's there to the committee, and we'll look for a convenient date. We'll get you in and show you some of these technology changes, because the Officer of the Future has far more technology available to them on the street. It's 2,000, it'll be 2,000 when they're done, in-vehicle mobile applications. So you'll remember, for those of you who've been out in a police car before, we had an in-vehicle thing where you could get messages from control room and those sort of things. Other than the radio, you get that. Those are in the process of being updated, and about 500 of those are out at the moment. So we're in the middle of that rollout of a change of technology. What that's also doing is addressing some of the big obsolescence issues. So we've spoken before about things like Windows XP as an operating platform. That's moving us to Windows 8 and Windows 10 in the newer cases in terms of all that technology. Then rolling up behind it, coming to the Deputy Mayor probably in the spring, is the replacement of the decision about the replacement of the core policing systems. So you'll hear a phrase called MIPS, which is basically all our policing systems. So that's our crime system, our intelligence system, our custody system, a whole range of things, bringing those together. And that will take a huge risk around some of the obsolescent technology we've had for a number of years. So this is an area we've made a huge amount of progress in. It's also given us a much better feeling for cost as well, and we've seen a shift, and we're trying to think through and working with HMIC and others how we show some of these costs, because we've tended to attribute a lot of these things in the past, oh, that's all back office. The reality is now, so where does the cost of the managed service of a body-worn video sit? Does that sit with the officer? Because you can't have an officer without it. So we're starting to look again and have some quite interesting debates about how we cost those, but it's absolutely the way to go.
Okay, that's very helpful to give us just a clearer practical picture rather than just talking about digital and what it means. But we've had issues in the past. So your previous digital strategy for 2014-17 promised 60 million of savings but delivered less than half.
Yes.
In last year's budget process, you tabled 38 million cumulative digital savings up to 2020-21, and then that they were completely removed, being told they didn't stack up financially. So what savings are in your budget this year, and what confidence can we have that you will actually meet them?
The actual figures...
So we've got 13
million, yeah.
In the next year.
13.1, yeah.
And confident around them. What we've done increasingly with the budgets, the only ones you'll see now where they're actually in a budget line are ones we're absolutely confident around. Now, you could argue there might be more savings based on just volumes, because a lot of contracts, particularly in technology, around volumes, and as volumes of users shrink, you might save money. But what we're trying to do is avoid double counting, and also identifying things that we can't then follow through and deliver.
And then your budget submission document shows no further savings from digital policing over the following 3 years. Why is that?
Well, at the moment, that's as far as we think we can go on our operating model at the moment. As we move to an operating model of potentially even a smaller organisation, then obviously we go back and look through and see what those potential are. You'll be aware as well, I spoke about breaking out of the one big contract and going for the Simon Towers. Yeah. There is also a timing point at which point those contracts are recompeted, because I'm trying to remember, 2 or 3 years in now? Maybe 2 years in. So in this cycle, those contracts will be recompeted. There might be more benefit in those, but we've got to be realistic as well. There could also be more cost. We've spoken before here about the impact of the fluctuation in currency rates. So we were hit quite hard because a lot of IT is charged in US dollars. When you see a 16% move in the currency, all of a sudden some of those costs come through. And as I say, increasingly with IT, we're getting a better handle on just what is the real costs. And those costs feel absolutely real to run a highly digital organisation.
And what discussions have you had with the Mayor's Chief Digital Officer over your digital policing strategy?
I know they've met. I've got...
So,
Siobhan.
so we've had 2 discussions with him from the MOPAC side and had set up an induction session for him with the Met. Unfortunately, that wasn't able to take place. I think he was...
It's next Friday, isn't it?
And so they're meeting out after Christmas. So it's just taken a little bit longer to get up and running in terms of going out, going to see the Met's technology and being involved. But in terms of our discussions with MOPAC, we've been taking him through the digital strategy that you've got, the areas where we think that there are real benefits in kind of widening that conversation, getting his wider input, challenge and scrutiny to help with this process getting started.
Good. I think that's probably covered it.
Okay. Senator Cooper?
Thank you very much. I mean, obviously, this is an absolutely business-critical area, given the reduction in numbers that we were just exploring. So, improving the use of digital equipment, and the police are quite a long way behind on this. Most other companies have done this far more extensively, particularly where you have a lot of operatives who go out and do things and then come back to base and have a need to record what they've been doing and then mesh it together with back office systems. One of the concerns, and I've gone through this kind of transformative process in smaller organisations, granted, but even in smaller organisations, perhaps with 1,200 or 1,500 staff, when you've got an existing pool of staff, obviously scaling that up for the Met, you often find that there are some people who perhaps are resistant to new technologies, or find them very difficult to transfer over an old way of working to a new way of working. So 2 questions really. I'm trying to figure out whether you're making special money available in your training budgets to help people get over that barrier. And I'm assuming that goes into the line that says employee-related expenditure, and that actually looks as though that budget is coming down from your outturn of this year. And also, is this something that you're going to start including as a person specification requirement for new recruits? Because obviously as new people come in, are you going to be looking for newer, younger officers who are sort of more au fait with operating in a more digitised way, perhaps in their personal lives or in previous roles, so that, and they can also offer some sort of leadership potentially to colleagues. So what are we going to do about training existing staff, perhaps who've operated in a very different way, and are we going to prioritise this for new recruits? Because I really think there's no point spending a lot of money on all the kit if people then really struggle to use it.
Well, to reassure you on a number of those fronts, so the idea of picking and selecting people who really use it, the notion, you've probably experienced it elsewhere, of super users is what we use in terms of doing that, to use those people who are really, really au fait with working with it and intuitively want to work with it. Your point about younger in service, absolutely. I think if you had younger in service and officers around this table, their frustration would be, can we even go even faster? But you've got to take everyone with you. But the reassuring thing, and we saw it a bit with body-worn video, actually once body-worn video started to roll out, the energy was, why can't I have it sooner? So I think there is some of that with the technology. And it has to be seen as well in the light of, alongside just delivering the technology, part of the programme of transformation of the Met is something called Smarter Working, which is all designed around the business changes that are needed to support this. Everything from the right docking stations, the right charging, Wi-Fi in buildings. It is part of a wider programme of transformation. It's not a case of saying, here's a laptop, off you go, get on with it and see how it goes. And the super users are really helpful in terms of testing and looking for new opportunities in terms of the software. So the days when, and you'll know this from many walks of life, the days when you spend ages in a sort of lab designing the product to the point where it's absolutely perfect have long gone. You get stuff out there, you test a beta version, you test it again, you enhance it and you do it. And with this switch in our technology, it's allowing us to do that for the first time.
That all sounds very encouraging, but there may still be some people who do need that bit of extra
training, and I just wanted to check
Yes.
the point about the,
yes. So
budget
one,
for training.
So one of the budgets you're looking at there is the employee engagement one is quite a small one. If you look at the ones around, so our change fund, which is where a lot of this work is sitting, is in the wider change fund money and the individual programmes that support it underneath.
Okay, so you've actually got some
Yes.
allocation
Yeah.
across a number of
Yes.
different budget headings.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Right, moving on to the next section is the Met's estates strategy, and Assemblymember Berry is leading on that.
I'll just finish off that section on IT, actually, because we're moving into capital numbers and things like that. In terms of the investment in capital equipment, is the IT equipment, capital spending one question? Yeah. And where do I find it in the budget? Because as far as I can see, I mean, there is, in the capital plan for this year, there's a line IT core infrastructure and replacement, but that sort of drops off over time. It's not got the rise I would have expected in it. And then in the last capital plan, there was a line called Enhanced Digital Policing for 2020, but that was lower and doesn't seem to be here anymore. So is it possible maybe in writing we could get an outline of the IT budget lines of what was planned and what was done?
I can provide you with more details. So in the capital programme, absolutely the things that you've identified, some of the, I suppose almost the asset management spend is quite sort of clearly spelt out, so the core infrastructure and the replacement programme. But within the transformation programme headings, so for example around optimising response, we've got fairly significant capital investment in IT for command and control. Within transforming investigations and prosecutions, the MIPS project that Craig referenced earlier, which is the replacement of most of our sort of core systems, is in there. But I think it may be helpful if I give you a written response just to show where the different elements of that sort of spend is. The reason why we do it this way is really the point that previously had been made. A lot of this investment is about business transformation, not simply buying a piece of kit. It's a much wider thing, which is why it's perhaps not quite as visible as you would like.
Yes, no, I would expect it to be quite complicated. Okay, so moving on to the estates plan. There's a lot of stuff going on in this budget to do with estates. There's, I mean, the main thing is the massive budget line transforming the MPS estate that's there in the capital plan. There's also quite a lot of capital receipts coming in. Can you outline roughly what's going on there and how it's going to have an impact on the Met's finances?
Okay, so the we have got a draft estate strategy which hopefully we will be looking to publicise later this year. So the estate strategy, we have got, maybe abundance is the wrong word, but we have got a lot of historic sort of estate across London, which just simply isn't sort of fit for purpose. Equally, we have got a need for much more sort of modern facilities for sort of policing. So given all of that sort of technology investment, we need to use our sort of estate in a different way. And we also are challenging ourselves to make quite significant savings in the back office as well. So we've got sort of targets to take out another about sort of 50 million from our sort of estate sort of revenue costs. So the strategy is really about shrinking that sort of estate sort of strategy to what we think is fit for purpose and delivering that sort of modernised Met delivery. So given that sort of officers have got the sort of technology that we've discussed, what does that look like? We know that existing sort of capacity use of most of our buildings is 40-50%, which just really isn't what you would expect in this day and age. So our estate sort of strategy, in essence, is spending a significant amount of money in terms of refurbishing and securing longer term accommodation. So that's both in terms of securing for all bits of policing, including sort of counter-terrorism. We have got a number of buildings that we are releasing as part of that sort of strategy. So we have got still a net in sort of investment even after doing that. but it does deliver a savings of when we get to the end of that, of just over £50 million a year. So overall, that estate strategy does give a return on investment of somewhere between sort of 12 and 14% in terms of that sort of net investment that we're making into that. And we end up with a much more sort of modern, suitable accommodation sort of fit for purpose for the future, that sort of operating model that we're looking at for 30,000 officers.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go into some more of the detail of that, if that's okay. So the line premises cost is the line where you're aiming to save money in your budget, and that 50,000 comes out by 2021-22.
50 million.
Sorry, 50 million. Yes.
Yes, it comes out towards the end of the period.
Okay, and you said you're going to publish a draft estate strategy later this year. Will that have in it details of what's being planned to invest in, as well as...
Yes, although so again, there is maybe more detail I can give to you if you are interested in terms of...
At this stage, you can give us more detail.
Sorry?
Now you can give us more detail.
Yes, in terms of the underpinning of what's in the capital programme, if that's helpful.
That would be really useful too. The other thing, I know we've looked at the public access strategy consultation. In that, there were long lists of things to be exited and disposed of, but they were public access related buildings. Is it possible to get a full list of the assets that you plan to dispose of that include other things like, I don't know, car parks and land and...
I think most of it was in there.
I mean, I'll make sure that you've got all of that.
Yeah, just if there was anything missing from that would be useful.
I think it's all publicly available.
That would be really useful. So the amount you're going to raise from capital receipts obviously is lower than the amount that you're going to spend on the Transforming the Estate programme in the budget period that we have. And your borrowing is going up during that period. You've got a doubling of interest costs, which doesn't seem particularly sustainable. And also it seems like you may even be going over the prudential borrowing limit that's written into the risks part of this, but I'm not sure. The tables 4 and 5 both show totals that go over the...
I think, so MOPAC do the borrowing limits, but I'm fairly confident they should be.
So you're very, very close to the limit.
I think it's. I think they calculated. I think MOPAC calculate that operating limit based on what we say that we're going to borrow. So I think it should be a fairly tight calculation. Obviously, I'd prefer if there was a bit of buffer in that, but I think that the calculation is what it is.
Just to clarify, the operating limit, as Linda says, is supposed to be what's really going to happen. There's also an authorised limit, a higher limit, which is actually the statutory target.
Yeah, all these numbers in these tables are very, very close together, so you seem to be very close to the edge in terms of that.
I mean, there is a significant difference between the authorised limit and the operating limit that I think gives quite a lot of scope for reality and variances and actual decisions to be made.
So the operating limit is what we are sort of authorised to do, which is tightly tied to the capital programme, and then, as David says, the authorised limit allows us to go to MOPAC and say, can we go further on the basis of whatever sort of decisions.
Okay, the question about interest costs, they do seem high compared with the rest of the GLA even in terms of the amounts that you're paying.
So I think what you're picking up is a mixture of the minimum revenue provision and interest costs.
Yeah.
So the bulk of it will be the minimum revenue provision. In terms of the interest costs over the period that we're talking about, I think we get to about sort of £15 million additionality in interest. The rest of that sort of increased will be the minimum revenue provision, which is the repayment of principal.
Do they borrow from the PWLB?
That's the other question actually. Yeah. In terms of the amount of interest there is, are you borrowing at Public Works Loan Board type rates?
So we haven't made decisions yet, and we obviously do that through the sort of GLA bit. We've assumed 10-year rates of 2.28%, which is a sort of current sort of rate, but the borrowing decisions will be taken as and when. We don't have to borrow in advance of needing the money.
And one of the things that we'll look at when MOPAC want to make those decisions is, because they're part of our Treasury strategy overall, whether, like LLDC, as we discussed yesterday, there'll be opportunities to actually get some of the trade-off of the fact that we're only earning 0.5% at the moment on our balances. But as Linda says, the rate is more like 2.28%. Therefore, could we not square some of that difference and actually then save Mopac some money?
Okay. Thank you very much. The final question I've got is... in terms of the capital projects, the budget submission document that was put in, I think this will follow on from the estate strategy. It says the capital programme's business cases must be approved by the management board and the deputy mayor. In what way can we scrutinise the capital projects and the plans that are made? So can we look at those business cases? Will they be published in mayoral decisions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, a decision, yeah.
They all go, if they're above £500,000, then they come to a deputy mayor for decision and they're put onto the Mopac website as,
and we see the business case,
see,
not just the summary.
There is, depending on commercial sensitivities and so on, there's sometimes a part 2, but the essence of the business case should all be in the part 1.
Okay, I'm asking because this is a lot of money. You're talking about something like £1.3
Absolutely.
billion pounds is going to be spent over the period,
Yep.
so we want to keep
Yep.
a good eye on,
Yeah.
on the various projects. My final question is about the savings being made from the public access and estates strategy. We were told there was an additional £8 million coming from the public access strategy, and I can't find that in the revenue budget. It seems like the premises costs actually go up by 10 million, and we were expecting a saving of 10 originally and then 8.
So the savings are profiled across the year, so the totality of savings coming out is 52 million.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the end of the programme. I would have to provide that sort of detail about when the specific public access savings are coming through.
So they're just somewhere in that.
They're
it
within
does go up for
within
the first
profile.
year and doesn't go down until 2020, 21. And that's when you expect to make the savings from things,
That's when
from
the bulk
closures
of
that have
the-
happened
the savings.
this month or last month.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all.
Okay, Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. Question to you, Sophie, please. In the main, when we vacate premises and so on, we tend to dispose of the properties. Now, TfL have changed their process. Instead of disposing of land and properties, or certainly land anyway, they are now taking the view that it's better to develop out those sites themselves. And then, although obviously you lose the immediate capital gain, you get an ongoing revenue stream. Can you tell me what work's been done on that by Mopac? I assume that would come under Mopac's remit rather than the Met, would it not?
It does come under Mopac and, well, obviously in discussion and consultation with the Met. But as you all know, TfL operates under different statutory guidelines and statutory requirements.
See, it's not a trick question,
No, I know, absolutely. Then TfL operates differently to Mopac and under different legislation to Mopac. So therefore, those avenues and those routes aren't open to us because of the need to get best value, and that's the position we're in.
Together with the different property portfolios between the Met and TfL, because TfL by definition tends to have property at transport hubs with high footfall. Police stations are often the kind of car parks and things that you're talking about that we've got. It is a different portfolio between the Met and TfL in terms of the opportunities.
Okay, it's just one site we sold in Ilford, and it's you could almost call it a site, a ransom site, because it actually unlocks a load of potential, and had we been aware of that, we could have got a lot more for it. And it's just, those sort of things are worth looking at, as what marriage values might those sites have.
So that's a slightly different question to the commercialisation question, isn't it? And actually, in terms of the Met Property Services, I think I believe that there is much better communication now between local authorities and the Met Property Services than there was previously. So those types of sites where it's unlocking sites, so those discussions can take place obviously making sure that we meet our statutory requirements.
Yeah,
Those
exactly,
discussions are happening with local authorities, and actually in terms of the property to maximise value as well.
Yeah, it just
so
seems
I think there has been a shift and a change in that.
Yeah, so it just seems a shame, doesn't it, that we can't get some revenue income, because once you've sold it, haven't you? It's gone.
I don't know if you've got an overage clause.
Or sell it to the mayor.
Sell it to the
There is also a challenge. Our core business is not running a commercial property.
No, of course.
We don't have those sort of skills. We'd have to buy them in. We've got really good skills in the property team about disposal of and those sorts of things and developing. But actually, colleagues at TfL, I've seen this, it's an impressive setup they've got. We don't have that sort of capacity, even in an organisation the size of the Met.
We certainly work closely with valuers on overage and marriage value to understand all the aspects of the site that our professional valuers can advise us on.
Okay, thank you.
Right. We've reached the final section, which is some tidying up questions that we couldn't slot into any of the other questions. Not very seamlessly, but nevertheless, they are important issues. And Assembly Member Cooper's leading on this for us.
Thank you. And I would have thought there are definitely some people, both at TfL and in other parts of this building, who can give you quite a lot of advice on how to maximise property value, perhaps from the housing and property team, for example, or even the planners. So a kind of a slightly random selection of questions. They don't necessarily relate to each other. One of them is about HQ costs, which you appear to have reduced from 654 million to 506. How have you managed to reduce those costs so dramatically? I think I'm probably looking to Linda for a comment on this.
I would love to say it's all HQ costs. I think the major answer with the 100 million savings that we've talked about, officer savings, is against our One Met model transformation before we push that out. So that's 100 million of that. The other big item is we've got some sort of spending in the current year on our back office support services transformation, so £20 million of that sort of one-off spend in the current year obviously isn't repeated next year. It's another sort of 20 million, and there are a few other sort of ancillary sort of differences, but that's the bulk of that sort of reduction.
And so do you foresee it being easy to achieve further reductions?
I think the bulk of the savings that we've made in previous years, we have taken a lot of savings out of our sort of back office in previous years. So when we talk about that £600-700 million savings that we've done to date, a lot of that has been taking our back office down. I think there probably are some things that we can still look at in our sort of Met HQ. There are still things that we want to review. We've talked about whether or not, when we get to the stage of having replaced all of our back office or our core sort of IT systems, are there opportunities to take our IT further down? We've talked about very sort of baked-in plans in terms of our estate strategy. Will absolutely bring that down. There are some other areas that we're quite interested looking a bit further in. So, for example, some of our administration around our sort of duties management is an area that we've got sort of targeted to look at. A few other sort of smaller areas like that, but I think probably the honest answer is I think we've done the big hard-hitting things over the last numbers of years, but there are still things that we can...
So a lot of small things that might add up to something, but not large items that you...
Aside from the property one.
Okay. We've just talked a bit about borrowing and operational borrowing and authorised borrowing. Looking at the reserve position, there was quite a lot of discussion about reserves last year and whether reserves were earmarked and allocated towards specific purposes, or whether there were free reserves that could be spent on anything, and quite a lot of discussion took place about that, also in the context of other parts of the GLA family. Are you expecting to maintain the general reserve at 46.6 million, and do you consider that to be tight? Because as a percentage that seems to be quite a low percentage, perhaps also compared to other forces.
I think our general reserves, we are expecting to hold that about sort of the 46 million. I think we will sort of look at that over... we are sort of required to sort of look at that sort of every year as part of that. Is it a robust, sustainable budget? My view at the moment, that is reasonable. As you say, it's not a huge amount against the size of the organisation, but I think it's reasonable. And I think in terms of looking at the history of bringing sort of our sort of budgets in on or under is relatively good. So I think that gives me certainly some confidence.
So you're saying it's adequate, but you would agree that it's quite a tight figure.
I think it's reasonable. I think it's tight. If so, for example, if we thought we were in a position that we had run down our earmarked reserves, which we're certainly doing, and we had the position where central government were not where I think they are in terms of special grant, I think I would perhaps be having a separate or very different sort of conversation with the Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor, but I don't think that's where we are at the moment. So I'm comfortable where that is at the moment. I think in terms of the other reserves that we have got a very sort of clear strategy to spend the earmarked reserves. So 14-15 we had reserves of at peak 420 million. So as you see, probably currently we've got about 240 million, so we've already sort of halved the amount of reserves that we've got. We have got sort of plans to bring that down closer to about 120 million by the end of this sort of budget period. So we do think that that's reasonable and credible, but given the caveats that I mentioned.
Okay. Moving on to a completely different area, but one that obviously is being piloted at the moment, and one of the drivers for this obviously is around the need to save money. How much has the Met already saved in the two pilot schemes for the Borough Command Unit merged areas, so Camden and Islington and the larger one in the east? How much savings have already been achieved?
I haven't got that figure with me. I can find it for you.
Would you be able to supply that to us subsequently?
Yeah, of course I can.
Because it would be interesting to find out how much has already been saved and how much that can inform the budgeting process for how much will be saved. Because obviously I assume that you are making some assumptions about savings on the ones that have not been implemented while the pilot is still ongoing.
Yes.
So we absolutely have the figures in terms of what we were assuming further on, and I think absolutely we'll provide those figures. But the pilots, some of them were run on different bases to see whether or not how it would work under sort of current establishment and how it would look under sort of future establishment. So that was kind of part of what the pilot work was trying to establish, which is really quite interesting.
No, we understand that, and we also understand obviously that there's been some changes in the way the pilots have been operating, particularly the one covering Barking and Dagenham and the other boroughs, because there was some huge concerns that emerged in terms of police response times, which have been highlighted by Councillor Rodwell, the leader of Barking and Dagenham Council particularly. So in view of the concerns over the issues that have arisen and the evaluation, which has also been delayed, which I think was originally we were talking about seeing that in September or October and then going live with all the merged BCUs, you know, from January onwards, was my original understanding. When are we now going to see the rollout, and what kind of impact will that have in terms of budget next year? And maybe that's one for Sophie.
You're right that we were looking to do an evaluation in Pathfinder sort of September, October, early autumn. And you're also right, absolutely, there were significant problems around response time. So it was only right that it was delayed, because you absolutely have to get that fundamental service to the public right. I am expecting the evaluation and business case. I was hoping for it before Christmas. It should be this week or next week, and I'm going to be briefing Assembly members from the Peace and Crime Committee, and those are constituencies those constituency assembly members whose constituencies are part of the Pathfinders, and what that shows. So we hope to take that decision before the end of January about what happens next. I think most people know that it's not going to be a big bang rollout, it's going to be incremental, but we'll be taking that formal decision by looking at the business case and the evaluation looking at savings, but always remembering that this was about modelling a reduction and how you provide that service.
Yes, my understanding is that, and I know that I'm sitting next to two of my colleagues who have obviously had their constituencies impacted on by the pilot in the east of London, and I know that, you know, obviously they've been very concerned and made sure that they've stayed in touch with what's going on in terms of the rollout of the pilot. In my own area, in Merton and Wandsworth, obviously there's been a lot that's been said because it's the only area in London where there will be 4 boroughs coming together, which obviously may have particular advantages, but it may have also additional complexities. And I think the particular issues that my two colleagues here are particularly have been concerned about relate to the 3-borough merger. So when you're talking about incrementally, is it going to be in different parts of London, linked to size? Are you going to go with the 2-borough mergers first? How is that going, you know, where things might be simpler to bring 2 together? And what impact will that have on savings if the incremental approach starts perhaps, you know, 3 months after when we thought it may originally start, given the delay on the evaluation?
So I think one of the things I take away from this is that actually you need to take that briefing on the evaluation of the business case to far more Assembly members, because it does impact on in terms of the next stage as well. When we talk about incrementally, the Met have already identified 2 areas of London who will be then, you know, are looking at the work to begin now, and they've put in some shadow commanders there, because one of the big lessons from the Pathfinders was you have to do the preparatory work well in advance, because it is.
Yes, I understand Sally Benatar has already taken that on.
Yes.
But what impact might this have on the budget, which is the other aspect?
Yeah. Well, it's not just the budget; it's more how you operate. Because, you know, one of the we've spoken a lot today around what does it mean to have an operation running at 30,000. It's very hard if you're at 30,000. You almost certainly can't run a 32-borough model. And particularly where you've got small boroughs, their establishments get so low, and you all know that already with some of the boroughs in the southwest before we started all of this. They've got small establishments, and it's very hard to run a 24/7 service with all the services you expect. So this move is entirely part of trying to manage the Met at 30,000. So yes, if we keep pushing it that way, it will long-term have an impact in terms of delivery and potentially on the budget. So I spoke about the ability to get people out for streamlining leadership. That's what we talk about when we talk about managing the BCUs in a different way to the way we manage boroughs. So we have to keep moving on the timescales we've talked about.
I think I've probably got as far as we can go on that one. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, members. We've reached the end of our... Oh, we haven't. I'm lying. This is what happens when you jump the fence early, you see. Did someone mention buses or something? Assembly Member Desai and then Assembly Member Berry.
It's not a question, but a request through you to the Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner and your staff. I think this is an opportune moment to ask for information, maybe by letter, about the income-raising activities of the Met. The income maximisation activities of the Met. In particular, is it Met Enterprise? Because I recall, was it the last budgetary round where we had a set of questions about the commercial activities, but Sunday Police and Crime Committee meetings, we've been given figures. This was a good few months ago. Yeah. And I think you're going to appoint a chief exec halfway through 2017, but also do you think that we'll all benefit from...
We'll include that in the sweep-up letter at the end, and perhaps
you.
if you could write back to us and let us have that information. Assembly Member Berry.
A tiny bit of clarification to ask about the table on page 24, if that's okay. It's 2 lines in there. One is the income to be allocated by the Mayor. That in section 4.8 explains that includes changes in assumptions in Home Office grant, extra income from increases in council tax and business rates, and it follows the provisional local government settlement, the provisional police settlement that was announced like 2 days before this was published. How certain is that number to be that number? As far as I can tell, that's just the council tax income.
That number is based upon the provisional police settlement from Grant.
Yeah.
We're obviously reliant upon what the Home Office may decide into the responses to that, but we're pretty clear that won't change. The other number there is obviously relates to council tax decisions the Mayor has proposed. And obviously he'll look carefully at the responses to the consultation document around the council tax increases he's proposed. But again, it's very clear that at the moment he's looking to maximise the police precept for the Met.
So that number includes all of the council tax increase, or just the additional bit because the referendum limit changed from 2%?
I mean, the elements of that 49 million are the police precept additional above what we previously assumed, so the 5.8% less the 1.9 previously assumed.
Yeah.
It allows for 2.2 million of retained business rates, that's the 1%, effectively reallocated from the non-police precept, together with the impact of the government freezing grant levels at an existing level this year, that's 23.7.
Great, that's really useful. It's just so similar to the council tax total that I wasn't sure what number had gone in there. The final question I've got is there's a line in corporate budgets called centrally held, and that increases quite a lot during this year, and I don't know what that is.
Okay, so the centrally held budgets, that's where we hold all of our allowance for inflation. So that's why it looks as if it's going up. So what we do at this, when we load budgets, obviously pay inflation goes to where the sort of people are working, and procurement inflation goes to where those sort of contracts are spent from. So it does get allocated out.
But you centralise there all your inflation assumptions in one place?
At this stage, yeah.
Including pay? Oh, that just includes a 1% pay.
It does include some of the pay as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other member? There you are, learn from your failures. Right, we are now finished. Can I thank our members for their attendance and for their answers. This is the end of the story. Obviously, we will write to you, and this is something that's going to be evolving over time, clearly. Members, can we note the contents of the discussion and the answers given? Okay, item 4 is the Budget and Performance Committee work programme for the remainder of the 17-18 year. Can we note that? Date of the next meeting, thrillingly, it's in 57 minutes in this room. Item 6 is any other business the chairman considers urgent. The only urgent business is lunch, so I declare the meeting.
Good day.
That's very nice of Gareth to offer to take us all to lunch.
GLA Chamber Sound.